Good evening, all, and welcome back. Tonight we head north into the frozen wilderness of Alaska, a place of endless silence, ancient forests, and secrets buried beneath the snow. These 10 true horror stories come from locals, hunters, and travelers who faced terrors at the edge of civilization. Subscribe now for nightly horror stories, and join me as we step into the land where the cold is not the only thing to fear. The first time I saw the lights, I had already learned more names for cold than I ever needed. The air at 30 below does not feel like air until your teeth ache and the hair inside your nose freezes into needles. The night over the bay had that hard shine that comes when the aurora hides behind thin cloud and the moon tries to pretend it is day. And my world narrowed to the tunnel of my headlamp and the familiar sound of my auger chewing a perfect black circle out of the ice. I had come out alone because the forecast promised a blow at dawn and the nets needed checking before the pressure ridge woke up and turned the whole line into splinters. The village sat behind me in a scatter of warm windows on the bluff, and the snow machine's track ran from town to my site like a taut line. I killed the auger, skated the slush with my skimmer, and knelt to feel the thickness with a gloved hand. 2 feet of clear new ice sandwiched a cloudy layer that sang when I put my ear to it. Under that, water moved with its own slow lungs. I eased my gaff down and felt for the lead line. The net tugged back the way a sleeping dog does when you nudge it. I grinned into my balaclava because a tug is a promise. Then the ice below my hole lit like a thin lampshade from a candle you did not place. It began as a faint wash of greenish light moving under the hole from left to right, a slow breath in the dark. I thought aurora and told myself I was seeing the sky reflected. But the sky was quiet that second, and the light had weight in the water that a reflection never does. It thickened into 2 points, then 3, and then a band like beads rolling along a wire. The shape drifted under the hole and away toward the next one, like a shy fish that has not decided if you are dangerous. I sat back on my heels and kept my mouth closed, because the air at 30 below punishes any man who wants to narrate. I turned my headlamp off to see it better, and the world got large and old, and the lights under the ice woke fully. 10 feet to my right, a new cluster blinked on and moved toward me in a slow arc. I checked my surroundings because nobody with sense watches a miracle without checking the edges of the lake for the less interesting things that kill you. The shore-fast ice lay smooth to the ridge. The ridge lay quiet like a sleeping seal. My snow machine steamed patiently, and the horizon gave nothing away. The light slid under my hole and stopped as if listening, then pulsed in a pattern I almost recognized and could not name. I fumbled my phone out of my chest pocket with stiff fingers, and it did what cold phones do, lied to me about its battery and died while opening the camera. I laughed once short and bitter, and the sound broke into the big night like something that should not. Bioluminescence crossed my mind because I used to read ocean books in rooms without windows when I was young and hungry. Jellyfish, dinoflagellates, the old stories about waves that glow when boats cut them. But this was January, and the bay held itself in a grip that split rocks. The water under shore-fast ice can carry plankton if the season is kind, but not like this, not beating out a little rhythm like a heart. I put the headlamp back on and aimed the beam at my boots to keep from killing the dark, then slid to the next hole, the one I drilled before supper. The lights moved with me under the ice, not fast, just steady, following the geometry of my footsteps above. I reached the old hole, skimmed it, and put my face close to the opening until frost flicked my lashes. The light swelled from below to meet me with the awkward grace of something with mass. It pooled under the circle and spread into 2 distinct discs, and then rose a finger width, and I found myself leaning back because the ice between us suddenly felt thinner than it had a minute ago. A small sound like fingernails on a drum rolled under the surface, a dry ticking that reminded me of Kaplan surfacing under spring ice and tapping their backs on our skates, except the season was wrong, and nobody should be playing that trick now. My VHF hissed in the sled without having been touched. Channel 16 woke like a radio station caught in a dream. A voice came through flat and compressed by distance, the way winter chews sound into hard little bites. East set, this is Blue Maria, head back and hug the bluff. The ridge is walking. Then the carrier dropped, and the radio went to a quiet so complete I thought I had imagined it. Blue Maria was my father's first skiff when I was too small to see over the transom without standing on the bait cooler. He sold it to a cousin when the price crashed, and then the cousin painted the name over with a new one. And then the cousin got old, and the boat sat by the seawall and fed moss for 10 years. And then a storm took it and made a story. I picked the radio up like a man picks up a gift he did not ask to receive. The channel remained empty. The light under the ice pressed itself into a shape like two eyes, then separated and drifted to either side of the hole with the deliberate speed of hands being placed on a tabletop. I asked myself what I would do if the ice bulged and the shape came up and I did not like my answer. I secured the net, threw my gear into the sled with more noise than snow deserved, and drove for the bluff without looking back until the shoreline gave me the bravery to do it. The ice behind me lay flat and silver under the thin cloud. The pressure ridge sat with all the innocence of something that has only been a killer its whole life. In town, the air felt warmer by 10 degrees because the hill breaks wind and lies about mercy. Light leaked under door frames and smoke from chimneys wrote neat lines on the low sky. I parked the machine and walked past my porch to the edge of the bluff from where you can see the bay make its dark arguments. I stood long enough for the cold to teach me manners, and when I turned toward home I saw a neighbor's kitchen window glow too steady for a house running honest fuel. I stepped closer to be sure my mind was right. It was the window of old man Larkin, who had died 2 winters ago with his boots on in his doorway. His grandson keeps the place, but not in January, and the line to the tank had been off since Thanksgiving. The glow looked like a halogen work light under a sheet draped across your hands, unnatural and too constant. I crossed the street and set my palm on the glass, and the heat on the other side made my skin sing. When I cupped my eyes, I saw nothing but a blank white and a ripple that moved behind it like a shadow of a person crossing a room that had forgotten walls. I took my hand away quickly, and my palm left no print, because the glass had chosen not to remember me. Sleep that night felt like a coat laid over my head to shut me up. I woke before dawn to the distinct sound of a house settling into a blow, and the man inside it trying to pretend he implements the plan. The forecast had not lied. Wind came in at 30 knots from the northeast and pushed the air into flatter notes. The radio scratched itself into consciousness before the coffee finished pretending to pour. The harbor guys were on with their practical voices, anchors holding, line chafe, a pallet crate gone for a walk. I dressed like an apology to my mother and took the machine down to the beach because nets do not care about your interior life. Snow lifted off the flats in sheets that made their own horizon. The cut to my sight had drifted, but the track remembered me and my skis re-educated it. I reached my holes and crouched into the lee of the sled to skim, and the first drag brought up slush that steamed in air that had decided to be cruel. The lights waited under the hole as if they had not lost me for hours. They swam to the circle and pulsed in a quick 3-beat that made my chest feel like a metronome had seized it. I looked toward the ridge and saw it move in the way only people who live with ice learn to watch. Not a slow lean, a lift. The ridge bowed up along the line like a dozer pushing a wave of stone behind it. Somewhere under the surface, a tide breathed an old breath, and the sheet flexed and sighed. The lights swung away from the hole and ran parallel to the ridge with a speed that threw my sense of scale into the dark. I followed them aloud without admitting that was what I was doing. I jogged along with my ice spud tapping 2 steps ahead to keep my weight for me. Every time the spud rang out a clean note, I said thank you. Every time it hit slush, I moved wider, because humility takes weight off a man in a way nothing else does. The lights veered left, right, and left again, carving a path just shy of the heave. I stayed stubbornly alive inside the passes they marked until the ridge stopped lifting, and the ice lay down again like a beast that has taught a lesson and accepted it. I stood with my hands on my knees and tasted iron on the back of my tongue, while the wind took a generous share of my face. I had a thought I did not want. I went to the hole nearest where my father had almost bought me a funeral when I was 9 by letting me ride on the stern while he chipped ice and promising my mother nothing. I knelt and turned my headlamp off because whatever this was did not like company made of LEDs. The lights came up together and pressed their brightness under the circle until the ice above them glowed green. I took off a glove with my teeth and set my bare palm to the ice. It burned, and it did not matter because under my hand came a tapping that did not belong to fish. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, pause, 3 taps. I did not know Morse code well enough to make a claim, and years of radio had taught me not to flatter myself with translations, but the pattern had a human patience. I spoke into the hole without raising my voice. I said, "Tell me where to go," and the light slid toward the south end of the line. They paused where the net's lead attached to the anchor and held there until a gust took my hat. Honest. I pulled the anchor up and found the lead line nicked and angry near a point where it crossed a curl in the bottom I could not see and should have anticipated. I cut out the bad length with a knife that lives on my hip and replaced it with spliced line from the sled, and before I tied the last knot, the lights whipped in a figure 8 I had seen my father make with his wrist when he wanted to say good without admitting tenderness. I tied the knot and leaned back and felt the net settle in the water like a lid closing quietly. I skated slush from the hole and covered it with snow and marked it with a willow and stood up to face the ridge like a man who thinks he can negotiate with geology. That night, the village kept its lights, braver than usual because wind pushes people into company. I left my stove on low and the dog snored like a boat hull rubbing a fender, and my head filled with the noise of an old VHF conversation. Blue Maria. This is East set. Do you copy? Blue Maria, this is East. And the carrier rose and fell as if the caller stood outside a door and did not want to be let in. I went to my father's shed because it is what you do when the night decides to measure you. He kept his logbook stacked neatly in plastic tubs that still smell faintly of diesel and lemons. He wrote every trip down like a man convinced God was an auditor. I found the book from the year we lost the old skiff and the winter logs tucked behind the summer pages like a secret that wanted to be polite. On a day in late January, he had written Ridge walked hard at 0400, lost 1 net under, K's headlamp never found, bless the wrists that push the line. And under that, in smaller letters, he wrote, the Blue Maria is just wood. Let her go, a sentence I did not know my father had ever learned how to write. K was Cask, the deckhand who had taught me to splice line and to hold my temper in my teeth, and who vanished in the white one night when the ridge opened a mouth and decided it could swallow. They found the net weeks later when the ice went out, torn and tired, and K was not in it, and the headlamp had not come ashore. My father never let me bring a light of my own down to the ice after that. He made the night his partner and left me in the periphery with a lantern and a boy's imagination. 2 evenings after the ridge's lesson, the wind stepped down to the low, constant whine that makes a man bring his shoulders up for no reason. I told myself I would leave the nets alone, and then I did not, because saying no to the water feels like refusing a relative. On the way out, I passed 2 kids on a machine with a sled behind, and one of them stood in the sled like a mast waving his arms to a girl on the bank because 15 makes us all brave enough to mistake a wave for armor. I drove to my line and checked the anchors and found everything sleeping like it should. Then the lights returned, not as 2 or 3 points, but as a line of small lanterns traveling under the sheet from north to south. The line passed my holes and did not slow, and I stood and watched it move toward the village, like a string being drawn through the water under all the places people put their weight. The hair on my neck made a plan without asking me. I swung onto the machine and followed along the line the way you follow an old dog through brush when it has found a trail and you refuse to insult it by calling. The lights crossed an old snow machine track that had drifted. The kids were headed toward the pressure ridge for a better view of the world because human brains do that. I caught them just shy of where the ridge had dug its front foot into the bay. The kids laughed at nothing and then at me and then at the idea of fear because I remember when fear is an insult. I killed the engine and used the voice my father used on me when he needed me to remember my name later. You take that machine and you turn it around and you follow my track like it owes you money, and you do not stop until your mother says you can. And I did not have to explain the last part because my face had learned how to carry the kind of authority people recognize. They did what I asked. The lights under the ice halted. I walked to the ridge to prove to myself nothing was needed from me anymore. A low sound, like someone dragging a sofa through a downstairs apartment, rolled through my boots. The ice at the ridge pitched up 6 inches in one slow bow, and the sheet split open along a seam that had been hiding under snow in a way that made my heart beat loud enough to count. Black water opened and sloshed over itself at a temperature that considers men a rumor. The place where the kids had been 30 seconds ago was a slush flow moving sideways. I tasted bile under my tongue, and the night tasted of metal and a wordless thanks. After that, I brought offerings, because I am not smart enough to be an atheist on a winter bay. I drilled a small hole away from my nets and dropped a new headlamp into it, with the strap wrapped around a pebble. I let it sink, and then watched the ice under the hole brighten and dim until I felt silly standing alone saying, "You're welcome." I made a habit of switching on my radio and listening for the small sounds between our own. Sometimes, on the edge of sleep, the Blue Maria would call my childhood nickname in a tone that pretended to be annoyed even though it had no right to be. Sometimes I would hear Cask's half laugh, the one that made men want to behave better, and then the carrier would slide away like a seal no longer interested in the ice hole you so diligently cleaned. A week later, the outflow wind swung, and the temperature climbed just enough for the surface to get greasy and dangerous. I thought about leaving the nets under and saving my pride, and then I remembered the night the lights ran toward town and the boys and I decided not to force fate to balance its books. I pulled them, rope by rope, lead line cutting a neat scar across the top of the hole. Herring came up blinking their silver eyes at a sky that hates their shape, and I apologized for using them to keep a winter running. In the middle of the last net, something heavy caught where nothing should have. I leaned back, and the rope took a minute to decide whether I deserved mercy, and then it let the thing go with the tired sigh of old knots. The gaff head broke the surface and lifted something glassy and green that I knew before my brain named it. It was a glass float, the old kind no one uses out here anymore, a soft green globe the size of a small melon with rope still fossilized into a net around it, and the patina that only ocean work gives a thing. A narrow band of glass ran around its equator, and under the ice's green light I could see letters pressed into the glass long ago. BM. I cradled it without meaning to feel any particular way, and the world swung a little under my boots in a way the wind could not take credit for. I kept the float for a day and felt like a thief in my own house. The dog would not look at it when it sat on the bench by the door. My father's log from the year we lost Cask had a slip of paper tucked into the back with a rubbing of a float's lettering on it, a piece of blue crayon rubbed over thin paper to bring up letters that might not matter to anyone other than a boy and a man who have accepted a private liturgy. The rubbing matched the glass. I took the float back down and set it on the ice. I drilled a hole wide but not generous, and slid the float under by easing the glass into the water and letting the rope keep it from running. The lights came up around it like fingers testing a precious thing. They pulsed once in a long, slow dim that felt like someone exhaling through their nose into a scarf. I left the rope trailing under the ice tied to a willow stub, because returns are rarely perfect, and we should let the world choose how to accept them. The next day the rope pulled up light and clean, and the glass had gone to a place men can tell stories about without ruining them. I do not think the lights are the headlamps of lost men still burning on the bay floor. Batteries do not care about ritual. I do not think they are plankton waking under a surface that never promised to help. I think the bay keeps a list, and the cold keeps a calendar, and the ice has learned to use light the way the sky does when it wants to make a point that words would cheapen. When storms come now, I hear the VHF breathe before a gust hits the sheet, and I anchor sooner and tie with a patience I used to reserve for sermons. When kids want to fly their machines along the ridge, I find them and turn their handlebars with my hand the same way my father turned mine when he desired obedience and feared explanations. When I walk onto the bay at night with the headlamp off because some darkness deserves to be met without artifice, I drill a small hole away from business and drop a new lamp into it with the strap around a pebble, and I let it sink and stay. The light below will swell and settle and run along the old holes like someone checking doors. Sometimes under the ice I hear the tap of wrists pushing a line. Sometimes I hear nothing at all, and that is also a kind of mercy. If you are a person who lives where winter grows its own floor, and you find yourself kneeling above a circle of black, while your breath makes the only cloud, and a light that is not yours arrives from below to look you in the face, ignore the urge to teach it what you think you know. Turn your lamp aside and let the bay use its own. Keep your radio on, even if it costs you silence. When an old call sign speaks and tells you to hug the bluff, do not ask what year it is. When the ridge walks, follow the path the light carves because pride breaks through faster than ice. Bring something to give back, a small weight of light the water can learn. If the tapping under your palm comes in a pattern that sounds like grammar, answer out loud even if you have to make the words up. The bay remembers every hand that learned its knots. It will not forgive a man for long, but it will sometimes lend him a mile. On the worst nights when the aurora sleeps and the sky hangs low and the ice groans like the earth making a list of names, I see the lights line up under the holes I drilled as if they are standing at attention. I salute them because bravado is cheap and gratitude buys you weather. Then I go home and warm my dog's ears and tell no one anything that would make the story stupid. And in the morning, I tie knots like a man who knows he is not alone even when nobody else stands on the ice. I was 2 hours west of the road system, and a lifetime from anyone who gets there by accident when the spruce closed in and the trail went thin under the sled. The cold came off the river in a low blue wall and made the inside of my helmet smell like battery plastic and wool. I had taken the volunteer slot to check the public use cabin after a week of heavy snow, because the district office wanted a quick look at the roof load and a note in the log, and because in January nobody rushes to be the person who parks a truck at the last plowed turnout and rides a single track until the world forgets the idea of lanes. The machine shouldered adrift, and the throttle nudged my glove, and the trees stepped back into a small clearing like a stagehand had tugged the curtain. The cabin stood where the old map said it would stand, a square of dark wood under a high roof pitched like an apology to weather, a porch with a slat bench, a door hung under an antler peg, the stovepipe shouldering out of the gable with a tin cap that had learned the wind's language. The clearing was clean, and the snow lay without track, except for one line that came from the tree line in a straight, polite approach. It was a single set of human prints, heel to toe, deep and sharp like someone had stepped down from the air. No drift crossed them, no rabbit scribbles cut them. They led to the door and stopped at the sill. There were no prints leading away. I idled the engine and listened for the small sounds that tell you whether you are a visitor or a fool. No voices, no saw going, no kettle on a boil, only the treetops rubbing and a raven off to the south, making the hard clack that means it has an opinion. I killed the engine, and the quiet landed in that soft shove the backcountry gives when it wants your attention. I swung off the sled and walked the prints from the last spruce to the porch, measuring unconsciously the gait and the depth the way anyone who has had to care about tracks learns to measure, and felt a little lift at the base of my skull that had nothing to do with cold. The prints were bare. No tread. No ridges. Toe shapes. 5. The big toe was too long and leaned toward the others like a hand learning to be a foot. I told myself a person in felt boots can leave an oval that looks smooth, and I let the part of my brain that tells stories about frostbite shut up. I set my glove on the latch and waited because you do not go banging into a cabin in Alaska like you are a landlord. I said hello once, at a volume meant to be neighborly, and not a challenge. The spruce answered with a soft click of snow shedding somewhere out of sight. The door swung in on a leather strap catch, and the first thing that hit me was the smell of wood smoke that has been gone an hour. The second was the sound of metal changing temperature in a room that had decided to stop pretending it was warm. The third was the sight of the cast iron stove with a bed of coals that held their red like a secret. Heat from that bed brushed my knuckles when I lifted the lid and gave it air, and the coals obliged by waking a little like a tired animal. Someone had stoked this not long ago. Nobody sat on the bunk under the window. The bunks were bare and swept. The table held the district's logbook, a coffee can of nails, a coil of lamp wick, a playing card with 3 corners, and a yellow pencil that had sharpened itself down to a stub over the years. A 5-gallon bucket stood in the corner half full of water with no skin of ice. The broom leaned at attention. The single-pane windows were trimmed in frost feathers, except for a hand-sized absence near the latch where warm breath had cleared it and left it to refreeze smooth. I put my hand on the table, and the wood felt like a body that had just stood up. I called out again and walked the room in a slow square, checking the loft, the gear pegs, the underspace of the bunks where packs migrate when people are not careful. Nothing. No cup, no glove, no scarf. Whoever came had either walked out on air or was doing a very good job making me misjudge the space. I stepped back onto the porch and looked down, expecting to see some trick tracks that showed me what I had missed. Nothing led away. The single line came to the sill and stopped. A dusting of new snow had started, the small fine grit that blows in from the trees and settles on everything like a thin memorandum, and the prints remained as fresh as a story told first. I drank the heat out of the stove and I made it my business. I set kindling and fed splits and opened the damper to chase the last cold out, the way you do when a cabin is both state property and the shape of your night. I radioed the district on the handheld and got the same freight train of ionized air that January always buys you this far from repeaters. The emergency channel gave me a whisper that sounded like 2 people arguing inside a pillow about whether the lake was safe. I ate a bar that could dent wood and set a pot of snow to melt, and sat with the logbook because names written small and neat are one of the few ways a place like that admits it is shared. The first entries were years old and cheerful in that performative way city people get when they learn they have survived something nature intended only to be indifferent about. There were pencil sketches of moose and notes on stoves and 2 recipes for bannock that argued about salt. Then there were the winter caretakers and the ranger lines, precise and useful, dates, temps, maintenance done. A page 3 years back had an entry from early March in a hand I recognized as the retired Rangers, a man who takes his letters the way he takes his coffee, strong and without options. It said, found prints to the sill, stove still warm, cabin swept, nobody present, advised district. The next winter, a different hand wrote prints again, and then a small notation on the facing page in that same careful hand that said, please do not greet an empty doorway, and for a second I felt like someone had put a hand on the crown of my hat and pressed. I closed the book, set it down, and watched the door as if words could create consequences. Snow dragged its quiet blanket across the clearing until the trees were suggestions and the roof edges went soft, and the world carried one color that changes names depending on whether a man is hopeful. I went out to check the sled and shook the snow off the seat and saw that the single line of prints had doubled. A new set had appeared alongside the first, twin for twin, same heel to toe, same depth, same bare arch, as if 2 people had walked in together at the exact same speed and stopped in the exact same place. I had not heard anyone arrive. No track from the trees fed them. It was as if the prints had grown where the snow fell. I told myself the wind lays its own illusions, and I failed myself convincingly for the space of 2 breaths. I carried more wood inside and barred the door with the oak brace because formality comforts men who cannot call the police. I tamped a seam of ash across the threshold because the old Athabascan woman who ran the school kitchen when I was 8 taught me to watch who will cross ash and who will not, and to ask my questions accordingly. I set my sleeping bag on the top bunk and sat on the lower, where the stove could see me and I could see the door, and I let the cabin vibrate itself warm around me like a heart remembering its job. Around full dark, the radio woke on its own and gave me a strong carrier with no voice, and then a call sign I had not heard since the patrol plane put down a pilot at the end of my road when I was a kid. It said KFN 30, which the office retired a decade ago when they changed the repeater map, and then a voice that might have been 2 people or 1 person resolved by weather said, Do not say, "Come in." I wanted to be 30 years smarter than I am, and I failed at that too, because anyone who has ever been raised to be polite will tell a door to come in if they mean to be a decent host. The latch lifted. I had set the bar. You can feel a door test its frame through your own bones when the world is cold enough that the wood speaks English. The latch lifted and settled once, twice, as if a hand had learned it long ago. The ash seam on the sill trembled under a breath moving across it from the other side, a clean exhale that pushed a line through it like a finger. The radio said, "Do not say it again," in that split voice, and I tasted how hard it would be to keep my mouth shut if the cold set a rule. Snow slid off the roof and landed in one soft shove, and the door gave up. I sat with my palms on my thighs and watched the seam. Nothing crossed. Something waited. Something has all night when you do not invite it. 2 hours later, the kettle on the stove sang a little because steel wants attention when routines return. I drank the kind of tea that older men pretend is doctor's orders and younger men pretend is a joke, and I let a slow calm happen in a place that has little desire to make calm for anyone. The logs burned down and I fed them, and the radio slept, and the dog I used to own that I still hear sometimes when I have my boots off did not shake his collar. Then the ash line moved. It did not smear like a boot would, or scuff like a bear would, or scatter the way a mouse does when it runs. It parted in 5 slender ovals that showed dark wood for the length of a breath, and then the ash slid back into place, as if a finger had pushed it from the other side, and the air above the sill cooled in a way my face recognized from men inhaling through their teeth to measure what they want, and how long they can pretend not to want it. I stood because standing is what men do when their knees instruct them. The window next to the door cleared a circle of frost 12 inches from the latch, as if somebody had laid their forehead there. I could see a shape beyond it that was only night, and the hint of spruce and the false reflection of my own shoulder in the glass. And then the circle refroze from the center outward, like a coin filling with metal. Sometime near the hour when the cabin takes a deep breath and the stove loses interest, the logbook fell off the table. There was no wind inside. There was no draft. It just traveled 8 inches like a dog deciding to sleep in a different spot, and hit the floor in a way that opened it to a page where my name had written itself in my own hand. It said, name, date, purpose. And then my scrawl had added came to check roof. Found prints to sill. Stove warm. No one inside. Do not greet an empty doorway. I had not written that. The pencil lay where it always lay, and my hand had a smear of yellow that could have been graphite and could have been superstition. I closed the book and put it back and set the pencil on top and told myself not to look away for more than a minute. And then the body made its old bargains, and the bunk above me turned from wood to a barked order, and I slept. In the middle of that sleep, I felt weight on the floorboards that did not belong to heat changing or wood learning its age. A foot placed itself near the end of my bag, then another. I woke without moving anything except my eyes, because movement gives away your location, and people who live in the woods teach their kids that before they teach them to read. The ash seam at the sill remained unbroken. The windows wore their ice. The stove ticked. The air above my sleeping bag cooled by a fraction and brought the smell of wet hair and wood smoke that is not yours. My tongue went dry in a hurry that betrayed me. The boards beside my bunk bowed enough to groan once, as if the weight there had shifted from the toes to the heel. I did not say a word. I did not raise my head. I did not pretend to pray, because I am not the kind of man who prays, except when he lies about other parts of his life, and I have no energy for that hobby anymore. The weight lifted after a time, and the silence made its usual brag about being harmless. Dawn came the way it does at that latitude in that month. First a rumor, then a rumor with a fact attached. I went outside into blue, and the cold put its hand up under my jacket like an old enemy that has given up on small talk. In the clearing, the prints had multiplied. They formed a loose ring. At a distance, a man with sense would respect, all the same, all heading in, none heading out, each a little too precise, each spaced like a pacing animal practicing patience. On the far side of the clearing by the first dark spruce, a set of prints stood offset from the others by half a foot, as if the thing that made them had learned to stand differently last year. I followed the ring once like a tourist and then stopped because it was leading me away from the trail by the most gentle suggestion I have ever received. I went back inside, wrote the barest thing in the log I could write without insulting the truth, packed my gear, and set a new line of ash on the sill for the next person to learn from or ignore. Before I closed the door, I said, "Thank you to the room, because I am a man who prefers to be polite to wood and iron and the rules of thresholds." I did not say come in. The ride out felt like leaving a house without apologizing to the chairs. The trail held its shape under new snow because I wanted it to. The trees lined up and took their small bow in the sled's wake. At the river, I cut across the flat, and the wind found my neck and made its claim. In the curve that leads to the last stand of spruce before the grade up to the road system, I saw prints again running along the bank. Not mine, not moose, not wolf. The same human shapes set into the drift with the calm of a person who does not tire. They paced me for 30 yards and then turned toward the water and did not sink. The surface under the top crust is a slurry in January there, and it carries men only the once and rewards overconfidence the way winter always does. The prince stepped onto it and left a chain of shallow depressions where there should have been a collapse. They crossed to the far bank and climbed into alders, and the bending branches shed snow on nothing. I throttled and kept my eyes on my own work because some questions are a currency you cannot afford. Back at the lot, I loaded the sled in the low-angle light that makes every decision feel rehearsed. The truck heater gave me air that smelled like dust and old coffee, and I took it like medicine. The handheld sat in the passenger seat and woke one last time before the noise of the road pretended to be civilization. The voice that came through this time was single and uncompressed, and it belonged to a ranger who retired before I joined the volunteer list. He said in that exhausted, friendly tone he had when he wanted to make men understand weather without making them defensive, "Keep your doors swept, your ash dry, and your mouth shut at thresholds." Then a click, no call sign, just the honest end of a transmission. In town, I stopped at the office and left a note that contained little and a map with more charcoal scribbles than a man needs to make. The district lead read it without correcting my handwriting and asked me if the roof was fine, and I said the roof was fine, and he nodded like we had both done a decent day's work. He said any sign of use, and I said the stove was warm and the bucket full and the bunks swept, and he said anyone there, and I said no one at all. He signed the sheet and did not ask me to make my story smaller. A week later, out of habit, and out of something I pretend is duty, I checked the logbook on the office shelf where they keep the duplicates from cabins that have learned to teach. The last page in the copy of that cabin's log had my writing where I expected it, and below it a new line I had not added that said, "Do not greet the empty doorway in a hand that was not mine," and also was. I ran my thumb along the pencil groove and felt the old urge to explain. I let it pass. Some winters I go back. I take a paper bag with coffee and a new box of matches and a fresh pencil, because when a place has a rule, your job as a visitor is to honor it and leave tools for the next one. The prints appear some years, and some years the clearing is as clean as a sheet, and the snow does nothing but be snow. When the prints come, I brush the sill with ash and I do not speak. When the radio cracks with a dead call sign, I listen, and I do not pretend to have a better radio. When the window clears a circle at the latch, I turn my headlamp off and let whoever stands there have their look, because some things only want inventory, not friendship. I have learned this much at least. In the forest, a door is a rule, and a rule is a language, and if you speak it wrong, the woods will teach you the right way. If you find fresh human prints to the sill of a cabin that holds nobody and everyone, stack wood, sweep, set water, write down the parts you can say without hurting the usefulness of the story, and keep your greeting for rooms that contain breath you can see. When you leave, say thank you and close the door, and do not look back until you are far enough away that the trees choose not to follow you in their quiet boots. The tundra will teach you what your name is worth as soon as the sun forgets to climb. In January, the light is a narrow coin, and the wind holds it between two fingers and decides whether to spend it. My line ran 40 miles out from the village through willows no higher than my knee, and across flats the color of old bone where the snow had been combed into sastrugi that could lift a sled or cut it. I set out before the blue rose at the horizon because steel works better before doubt wakes. The machine ran strong. The runners hissed. The sky was a bowl of low stars, and the cold put a clean hand over my face inside the mask to remind me what I owed it. I had a pack full of pansets and scent, a coil of snare wire, flagging for the unwise days, a little stove, and the old .223 in the scabbard that my father tuned for foxes and for the idea of wolves. Where the willow draws thicken and the creek beds twist, the martins travel like thoughts through rooms. Out there, every animal owns a map more honest than ours. I try to borrow it with steel and patience and pretend I know anything about ownership. Near the first creek bend, I killed the engine and listened, because sound tells you if a day will be a ledger or a sermon. No ravens yet, no fox bark, just the faint leather whisper of snow dragging across snow. I checked a set where a fox had danced the night before, little tulip prints coming in and going out and nothing sprung. The bait was clean and cold, the pan feathered over with a dusting so delicate, I felt silly lifting it with a breath. I brushed it, reset, left a fresh line of scent, walked back to the machine, making my steps wide so my tracks would tell me nothing useful later, and caught the corner of my own shadow in the headlamp against the cut bank. It stretched twice my height and ran off across the flat in a way that made me grin because we like to be bigger for a second than we are. When I switched the lamp off and the moon took over, the shadow should have come in and laid at my boots, but it did not. It stayed long on the snow, a black smear pointing east where the sky was paler, and the hairs on my forearms prickled under too many layers for that to be a trick of air. I told myself the moon was low and the angles were odd, and the sastrugi cut the light into shapes a city man would call optics. I told myself a lot over the next mile while the machine hummed and the cold tried to write its name into my joints. At the second draw, the track of a single caribou crossed and then disappeared into a drift without explanation, the line of its hooves ending in a smooth mound as neat as a door closed by a polite person. I dismounted, bent, touched the crust where it should have broken, felt only hardness, and looked up because you pay attention when the ground lies to you. The long black on the snow lay parallel to my machine again, but the moon had shifted behind thin cloud and the angle was wrong for what I saw. The shadow pointed the same direction it had before, long and patient, like a route marked with tar on a white map. I stamped my boot and watched my own small true shadow hop like a good dog at heel. The other did not. I breathed and the mask iced and my breath found its old panic before I called it back. I moved on because work is the sharpest mercy I know. At the third creek, a shallow braiding of channels that weaves half a mile through willow and windfall, the snow lay smoother than a sheet in a good hotel, and the machine floated across like a dream that refuses to admit gravity. I set 2 snares in the gap under a leaning willow where I have caught 3 fox and a wolverine over 5 winters. I tucked in a pan set at a little tee of trails and brushed my tracks. When I stood, the long shade ran along the willow trunks and slid across the set bed as if dipping a finger to test the steel. I reached back and felt the scabbard out of instinct. The rifle sat where it always sits, a small thought of safety in a town where safety is a shrug. I told myself again about optics, and then my radio crackled in my chest pocket with a sound like paper being crumpled by teeth, and a voice said my name and then stopped. I thumbed the transmit as if I could push my pulse through it, and the carrier answered me with a steady hum. The voice had been my father's, or someone who likes to teach a son how to listen. He has been dead 4 winters. He would not waste a battery on making fun of me for believing in radios. Past noon, the sky bent toward pewter, and the wind decided to come from the northwest in that particular flat wall it builds when it wants to teach a machine new tricks. I ran the long reach between the stunted spruce and the old river, and felt the ski runners chatter as the sastrugi got sharp. At my marten boxes, I found one sprung and empty with a little tuft of guard hair and a story I could not read. The second held a small body, stiff and perfect as carved wood, a clean kill, a decent pelt for a winter this tight. I worked quick with my gloves off, fingers going numb in the way you can time if you live long enough. While I skinned, I kept my lamp set low to one side because night comes like a curtain in these latitudes, and men who ignore that become names we say with respect and pity. The long shade took that as invitation and crept closer until it reached the edge of my light like a puddle reaching a stove. I watched it stop there. a dark so dense it had an outline, and I told it aloud to wait its turn because a man alone will narrate to wolves, ghosts, and machinery, if that is the best company available. On the flats above the river, the wind found a pitch that makes a person think of glass grinding. The sky brightened with a thin moon and a stripe of cloud, and the aurora smudged itself into the idea of a curtain behind the cloud and promised nothing. My sled bounced, the load shifted, the lashings complained, and the horizon learned a new suggestion. That was when I saw it standing, a mile off, maybe less, in the open where the sastrugi left no place for tall things to hide. A column of dark stood on the snow where no column should be. It was not a spruce. It was not a hunter. It was a lack of light. The height of a house, wide as a freight container on end. Edges a little soft like smoke that had learned manners. It stood and did not shake in the wind that made my parka hum. When I moved, it did not. When I stopped, it did not. When I blinked, it remained. The long shade at my runner tips ran away from me toward that standing absence, and ended at its base like water seeking a drain. I have been afraid many kinds of ways in a half-decent life, and that was a new entry on the ledger. The machine knocked up a small berm of powder as I braked, and the plume drifted into the column and did not come out the far side. I circled wide without meaning to call it that, because circles are what you make when you do not understand a thing and want to at least be polite. The column turned in place without moving, and kept itself between me and the low sun like a jealous child. On the radio, I heard a single syllable that could have been my name, or could have been wind-making vowels in an old wire. I ran the machine hard to the river cut, because rivers have rules, and even frozen ones can serve as borders against the imagination. The cut dropped 8 feet, blew clean to glare ice, then drifted again in a long tongue that pointed east. I took the glare and let the studs bite like good dogs. The column slid to the bank and traveled with me without touching the ice, keeping pace with the unjust ease of something that has never bought gas. My shadow under the high moon tried to behave, while the long shade threw itself ahead of me as if trying to get to where I would be. I cut to the opposite bank and climbed out through willow. The column did not cross. It stayed on the south bank, taller now, or perhaps nearer, and it turned toward me as a face turns even when you cannot quite make out the features. I killed the engine, and the cold arrived as if it had been waiting outside the door for me to touch the knob. In the sudden quiet, I heard the oldest sound on earth, the river groaning under ice, a bass note that says the world is still moving while your boots insist nothing is. The column leaned as if listening to the same note. Then the ice shouted a higher crack, and the sound ran down the cut and into my feet like electricity. I yanked the starter before I yanked a thought, and threw the throttle, and the machine took the climb like the old horse it is. Behind me, a long black stripe shot across the glare ice. Not a crack, not a shadow of willow, a painted line of absence that traveled faster than a thrown rope. It hit the far bank where I had been and climbed it until it reached the top and laid itself down into nothing, like it had found enough of me for the moment. At the next cache, a little plywood box on stilts where I keep gas and a tool roll and enough extra to pretend to be responsible, I refueled with hands that wanted to pretend they were still good at fiddly caps. The long shade had found it first. On the snow around the posts lay prints where wind had tried to fill them and failed. They were not wolf or fox or lynx or man. They were the size of a frying pan, 5 ovals on a fan, the big toe longer than it wanted to be. The same shape that came to the cabin I once checked for the district and politely refused to be invited. The column stood at the edge of the clearing and did not love or hate the fact that I had noticed it. The radio cracked, and a voice I had not earned said, "Do not run at dusk and do not face the white with your back to it. I speak some Inupiaq from men who taught me what I could carry, and I have heard the old talk about things that walk the flats when there is nothing to cast them. The elders in my boyhood called it by a half-dozen names in a half-dozen tongues depending on who was willing to share with a child. The name I use in my head for it is the long shade, because pride has no place to stand out here. I learned something that day that should have been obvious. The Longshade kept the rule of light that nothing else on the tundra respects. It would not cross glare ice. It would not walk into brightness that had nowhere to go. It followed the margins where blue snow turns to white and where drifts throw a ragged edge. It walked the lee side of anything like a cautious man. It grew when my lamp burned hard and shrank when I killed it. It wanted me looking over my shoulder at the dark behind me, not squinting into the pale ahead. It wanted me turned around at dusk on a flat with no edges. That is how men end up walking in circles until their skin forgets fingers. So I made a plan that was mostly a prayer disguised as work. I would take it to a place where the rule would hurt it. There is a wide open lake bed 4 miles east that blows clean some winters and stays scoured to ice because the wind twins itself into a knife there. I pushed the machine hard that way, cutting corners where the willows allow it and letting the sled jump the small breaks because speed is one way to pretend a plan is wisdom. The column kept pace at a comfortable remove, never closer than 1 machine length, never so far that I could tell myself it had returned to whatever wall it fell from. On the last ridge before the lake, I stopped and checked the wind, because wind is the only partner who will tell you the truth. It came straight down the throat of the lake as promised, and the surface glinted like a city street, dark in the middle, light on the edges, pebbled where snow had tried and failed to root. I killed the headlamp and let the moon and the pale horizon do the work. I dropped in. The runners hissed and then sang as the studs bit, and I rode the machine standing so I could place weight and look far without staring at my own small, brave light. The Longshade came to the edge and let itself spill onto the ice like ink. It stopped 3 body lengths out as if the ice were a thought it had not finished. It held, quivered a fraction like heat, and then pulled back to the snow and laid long on the edge while I cut across the glass. I kept the engine low so I could hear the ice talk. If it called me a fool, I would turn and accept that name. It did not. It groaned and sang and told me I had time. I curved to keep the near edge just close enough to make it chase and watched it slither along, always nearer, never crossing. At the eastern shore, the snow piled again and the line broke into small lines around hummocks and willow teeth. The column drew itself up and stood again like a man who thinks he has arrived. I set the machine in a shallow bowl of drift where the wind had built a clean wall. I unlashed the sled, got the stove lid in the lee, and laid out a row of road flares I carry for sled breakdown and for the need to be seen. The column leaned. The Longshade thickened at the base like a tree deciding to squat. I took the 223 and laid it on my knees because habit comforts, and I am not above it. I waited for the wind to dim a fraction as it always does between its own thoughts, and then I struck 2 flares and threw them as far as my arm would allow onto the glare ice left and right of the bowl. Red bled across the glass in 2 wide pools. The column flinched, or the wind made it pretend to. The Longshade drew back from the edge as the brightness ran under its feet where there was no snow to shelter it. I threw a 3rd flare straight ahead and watched the light surge along the ice like syrup on a plate. The Longshade split along the edge of that light and tried to reform on the far side, but the wind pushed the brightness further, and the split would not heal. I did not roar like a winning boy. I did not grin like a man who has defeated a rule. I simply stood and felt the pressure on the back of my neck reduce by a degree that made me almost dizzy. The radio crackled once more with a voice that had traveled too far to stay honest and said, "Do not run to the dark now." I understood. The Longshade could be made to starve, but not if I mistook a small victory for a map. I sat with the stove and the rifle and the flares and watched the red fade to orange and then to nothing. The column reassembled itself on the far side of the bowl with the patience of a river repairing a bank, and I felt a gratitude I did not expect for its consistency. A person can live with an enemy who follows rules. When the flares died entirely, I banked the stove, packed the sled, and put the machine into the track I had made on the lake, keeping to the ice, keeping the light behind me low enough not to help it, and humming an old song from my father about keeping your nose clean that had nothing to do with anything except surviving a boyhood. The ride back took the day's light and its courage. At the river cut, I listened hard and crossed at the same place because nothing out here loves a man who changes plans at dusk. The long shade harried the bank, lay itself out long and thin, then drew back, then came again, never crossing, and I began to feel the edge of pity for a thing that cannot choose water. Pity is an indulgence no one gets to buy on the tundra at 20 below. I spent none of it. Near the village, the first spruce stood like choir boys in bad coats. The wind climbed those trees and came down in a different key. My machine smelted into the soundscape of town. The longshade came to the last open drift, leaned, and took a step toward the plowed road like it wanted to learn. The streetlight by the old water tank threw a perfect circle onto packed snow. The longshade hit that circle and became ordinary nothing for one footstep, and then gathered again on the far rim. I watched it hesitate, not from fear, from a knowledge born in it that there is such a thing as a boundary made of light chosen by men with shovels and bulbs. I parked behind my house where the wind cannot casually visit, and I sat until my hands had stopped imitating a bird. Inside, I set the rifle by the door, and the stove gave me a heat that smelled of spruce and dust and last summer. I took the radio from my pocket and set it on the table, and it stuttered with a single syllable that might have been my name or somebody else's old warning. I slept without choosing it and dreamed of a dark that follows rules, and a boy moving his father's hand off a hot stove without saying a word to insult the lesson. A week later, I ran the line again, because wolves and weather do not sign contracts, and because work forgives a man more than whiskey does. The longshade came with me for part of the way, as a courtesy to tradition. It stood when I stood, and it leaned when I leaned. When I crossed the same lake, it lay down at the edge like a dog told to stay. At the cabin where we warm and write names, I found on the sill a seam of ash someone else had laid, swept neat, unbroken, telling me the old rules are still in force and the woods still accept respectful company. In the logbook, another hand wrote, "Do not face the white with your back to it." And I added, "Under that light makes borders, and borders keep men honest," and that was as much as I dared put in a book strangers read. If you take nothing else from a story told by a man who spends too many hours with his helmet fogging and his fingers learning numbers they should forget, take this. The tundra has shapes that do not care whether you believe in them. Some of those shapes will follow you like responsibility. Some will try to make you walk into your own small circle until your feet forget straight lines. The longshade walks where light makes a place to set a foot. Do not feed it with your lamp at your back. Do not turn at dusk to admire the dusk. Do not cross glare ice slow and proud, while something that does not cross it learns your name. Put light where it cannot stand. Keep the ice in your plan. Listen to radios that should not work if they have the right advice. And when the wind drags a coin of daylight across the flats and you feel taller than you are, remember that every extra inch belongs to a shadow that is patient and old and that will outlast your boots if you let it. I still run the line. The machine still purrs and coughs in all the same places. The foxes still test the pans, and the martins still slide into boxes like small prayers being answered. The longshade comes when it wants, keeps pace when it pleases, and stops at the places I have marked with the bright dead circles that men put on poles to convince themselves night has corners. I will age into a man who tells children not to invite what waits on the lee side, not because I'm afraid of telling ghost stories, but because there are rules out there that keep people alive. And once you learn them, you understand they are not superstitions. They are maps written in dark and white. The Astar woke the way machines do when the temperature dares them to be honest. A grumble through the mounts, a shiver along the skids, the governor catching up to my hand. Dawn was still a rumor behind the Chugach, and the ramp light painted the hangar snow a bruise color. I had already scraped frost from the bubble once, and the rag froze into a board at my feet. Dispatch pushed a coordinate string to the tablet, and the words "missing snow machiners" arrived before the rotor was through its lazy count to flight speed. 5 miles west of a line the locals call the Nail, because it pins the weather down, 20 knots out of the northeast, blowing powder over hard crust, visibility meaningless in the flat light. We had a med bag, a hypothermia kit, a litter folded into the back, and the old green thermos the crew refuses to retire because coffee helps bravery pass for common sense. I lifted into the blue dark that lives over the airport half the winter and felt the skids remember how to be feet again. The tower handed me the frequency I wanted, and then signed off with the tight politeness of people who have never landed in a bowl that eats reference points. I stayed low along the river to keep a horizontal line in my life and watched the world turn from neon to graphite. At 5 minutes out, the tablet went white with the kind of cold glitch you learn not to get poetic about. I still had GPS in my head because repetition tattoos maps onto a pilot while he pretends it is a skill. The wind went from a shove to a knife at the mouth of the valley, and the light did that trick where it makes every surface one shade, so your brain stops believing in distance. My crew chief, Walker, kept his hand on the litter frame to keep something still in his world and read the air through the bubble like he was tasting it. We tried ground for the party on the common traffic advisory and got nothing but our own voice behaving badly. We tried state SAR. A backcountry pilot chimed in that he had seen 2 machines head into the nail an hour past sunset, and felt old guilt zip his words up to a pitch no man seeks. I was setting up for a high recon of a basin that can make you look like a god for 2 minutes and then take your helicopter and your marriage, and this is what I heard, not in my headset from any radio, but over the snow in the same way rotor noise pushes through your clothing. It was a voice that did not belong to electronics. It carried the hollowed resonance you get when you shout down into a quarry. It said, "Hold the ridge and slide the tail left," and I did not like that my hand obeyed before my mind filed complaint. I told myself wind can speak, the rotor disc writes its own grammar in spindrift, and a pilot with enough hours will admit he has mistaken physics for speech on less sleep than is legal. We came over the first ridge, and the world went white in a breath as the wind lifted a sheet of powder into our faces, and the bubble turned into a frosted shower door. I added power, and felt the familiar theft as the snow I had stirred came back to me, and the instruments tried to pretend the horizon still existed. Walker put a gloved hand on my shoulder to tell my back what my eyes could not, and said easy like it was a lever I could find. The voice over the snow spoke again. It did not use call signs or prayer. It said, "Count 3 and you will see black," and I counted, because men count when they are told by the right tone. At 1, the world was a cut piece of paper. At 2, it pulsed like a fainting animal. At 3, a stripe of river dark opened at our 10 o'clock, and I slid the tail left to plant that darkness in the chin bubble and believe again that down was a friend. We rode the river stripe until the white decided to be honest again, and I put the ridge at my left and we ghosted along the benches while Walker scanned for a shape that did not want to exist. The first sign we were near anything living was the kind of texture in the snow you do not get from wind. A soft churn and a narrow run of willows about 80 yards from a drifted cut bank, like 2 machines had catwalked a little too close, and then the wind had tried to erase the conversation. I set the A-star into a shallow hold over the flatter crust and watched the spindrift skim like river water, while the skids ghosted their own shadows. The intercom popped with static shaped like a warning. Guard on 121.5 remained its calm, indifferent self. SAR was all business. The voice over the snow ignored proper channels and came in without Helvetica. It said, "Put your ear on your window," and I did because it had already borrowed my hands. The bubble was cold enough to keep thoughts simple. Over the rotor beat and the hiss of the wind I heard it, not the words first, but the shape of a human voice trying too hard. Then the words arrived, as if dragged across a long table. "We are here. We are here. We are here." It was coming from the snow itself, an old trick of terrain and air and the way sound learns to travel under a winter sheet. Walker heard it too, and we both stopped talking, not because we were afraid, but because we had the sense to let information rise through noise without being insulted. I did a wide pedal turn to bring the tail into the wind and bled power down by degrees to see how much ground effect I could buy without throwing the basin into a whiteout. The voice came again and moved with us without caring where our antennas pointed. "Right of the cut," it said, like a pastime, like a parent telling a child where the ladle is. I saw a contour I did not like, and then I recognized it as a sled half buried where a broad drift had migrated. The dogs in my head that bark about avalanche came awake as if the discomfort had been theirs to nurse. The slope above the cut had that smooth, porched look that tells you slabs have been thinking for a while. The voice over the snow said, "Do not move your air," and it put a pressure on my skull like a helmet that wants to be in order. I backed the ship away in a slow, ugly crawl that would make any B-roll editor fire you. I held her steady behind a low roll, and Walker put the nose of the FLIR at the drift, and we saw what we needed to see. A hand, bare and blue at the knuckles, the rest of a person under a slab that had set like concrete at a wrong angle. We shut the ship down, because there is a time when rotor wash is a sin. The silence after a turbine spin down in a basin like that has a taste. The wind speaks, the snow whispers, and your blood finds a key it forgot. We post-holed in, hips fighting powder that had drifted into an easy trap, shovels from the back of the ship digging without trying to show off. The hand belonged to a woman too young to understand she had miscounted the distance to the cut. She had a pulse when we got to her face because the slab had left her a cruel pocket. Her lips had that slow gray that argues with a brain. We packaged her head in clear plastic and covered the rest with what heat we carried. Her partner was 10 feet downslope under hard stuff that had cemented into a new layer. The voice over the snow told me to stop, and I hated it for not giving me options. Walker gave me the look we give each other when the choice is between a corpse and another one. We worked the woman back to where the ship could hover without turning the valley into milk, and I put her in, and we locked the doors, and I kept the blades low and stable while Walker hung out performing rope tricks with a litter frame my flight instructor would have called undignified. The voice over the snow migrated with our movement and spoke again, and this time I knew the words without their sound. They were my name in a tone my mentor used in my first summer when I tried to take a canyon like a man, trying to prove something to strangers. He had died in a machine I would not insult by describing. He had taught me to count gusts and to wait on the cusp of authority until rules agreed. He had never called me what the snow called me. I ignored it, because knowing what not to let into a cockpit is a skill. We lifted, slid sideways to keep the wash off the slab, and took a hover into a bowl where a willow thicket could break a little wind. I staged, set, took power, and let the long landscape lift under us again. The ride back ran along the river and then over the low hill country where the world has the decency to give you points of reference. The voices stayed with us. Sometimes the woman's voice I had pulled out of the drift answered herself from the snow under us with a delay that ate at me. Sometimes old call signs from the guard channel that the FAA retired a decade ago braided through the wind as if a recorder had been buried 15 miles wide. "Keep your lane," one said in a voice I have only ever heard in my own dark. "Do not turn your back to the white," said another that belonged to nobody living. I sat down at the pad while the med team ran the ritual that keeps professionals from breaking. And I watched the woman take air properly and hated the way relief works on a pilot because it is always immediately replaced by shame for what you did not do. Walker wrote times and temperatures and a small after-action that pretended to be cooler than it was, and I put my hand on the bubble to feel it bleed heat. And that was when the wind returned the favor by letting me hear the partner's voice without electronics say help. We went back before reason caught up. Republic fuel, quick skim of the bubble, rotors biting air that wanted to be a story. Night in winter here is not a cloak. It is the room. The basin waited without making a sound you could charge rent for. The slab line had not crept, and no new signs of instability insulted us. The snow over the buried machine had settled as exactly as it could. I put the ship into a steady hover under the ridge with the tail in the wind, and let the disc write circles into the air without touching a thing, and Walker went downslope on a 90-foot line, slow and sideways, boots checking for the bubble around the body that the slab sometimes leaves when it feels like letting a man live. The voice over the snow gave me a countdown that matched the wobble in my heart. 10 feet, 8, 6. Hold. Walker's gloved hand found a shoulder in the wrong angle and a face that had been given just enough air. He set the sling, set the strap, set the hope. We brought him up like a misfired prayer, slow and with nothing fancy. At the door, the basin tried to erase us by lifting a sheet of spindrift that wanted to be the sky. I felt the ship sink toward the one thing in the valley with enough mass to argue, and I added power like an apology. The voice said not there, and I took a breath, rolled a little left, and the downwash reorganized the basin into the kind of polite blizzard you can do business in. Back at the pad, the partner learned to breathe again too, and I let my hands do what they always do after a thing that belongs on a plaque, which is shake and then misbehave with zippers. Walker laughed one sick half-laugh that lets a crew chief keep his heart and got coffee in the woman's fingers like an old man. Everyone else did everything they had to do with the kind of grace they let you believe will be there when you come in hurting from the sky. I drove the A-Star back to her stall and set her down and bled off the spin with the kind of tenderness men save for machines and dogs. The hangar swallowed the sound. The wind took the empty parts back. The bubble fogged around my breath and then cleared itself like a stubborn conscience. You would think the voices would be a one-night story you tell to the wrong drinking buddy and then stop telling. They were not. They visited when the wind sat at a certain angle over a certain kind of snow, when the rotor wrote a particular circle in powder, when flat light took away the border between distance and arrogance. Sometimes they warned, and every time I obeyed, I stayed alive. And sometimes someone else did too. Do not bring your air down here, they would say over the hardpan where a cornice learns lies. Wait 3 counts, then slide, they would order when a downdraft thought it owned me. One night on guard, I heard my mentor hum a little as I eased a patient behind a ridge, and I cried without ceremony, and the ship did not punish me for it. Sometimes, and this is the part I hate telling, the voices lied. In a basin north of Talkeetna, I heard a child naming snow machines as if pointing at a picture book, while the actual air insults stacked up like laundry. In a bowl west of the Nail, a woman called me by the name only a wife gets to use and asked me to bring the ship down now, right where a sheet of wind had polished ice into a phrase you could mistake for language if you were lonely enough. I learned to sort. I learned the rule that sits under rules. The true voices do not ask for me. They tell me how to fly the air I can feel in my bones. The false voices use my name or try to borrow one, and they cost altitude and fuel and days. The worst test came in April when the sun returned with its long, sullen arc, and the hills relearned shadow. A small, fixed wing went cold on final, toward a river bar, and the beacon told us nothing useful. We had the grid and the family at the road and the kind of silence people write about from inside cars. I took the A-Star into a search pattern that would have looked good on paper and felt like a lie in the air. The wind was soft and indecisive, the snow rotten, the rivers thawing from the banks. The voices arrived in a choir that would have turned a braver man than me superstitious. Over the snow, I heard 5 people talk about heading and drift, and then an old call sign with letters I have not seen on a panel since I was 20 said "Follow the Ravens." And that was the first thing that felt like this world. We banked toward 3 black commas moving along a bend, and they took us over a bar that had held a set of tire tracks too new for drift to pretend ignorance. The plane sat 50 yards into the alder, nose at a compromise with Willow, both doors open, pilot slumped, passenger upright and making bargains with air. We put it on the bar without asking our luck for a second helping. Walker ran a wilderness medicine clinic in 15 seconds. The Ravens took payment in a sandwich I had not planned to spend. The voices receded like a tide that knows your schedule better than you do. I wrote none of this in the official log. I put times and fuel and temps and crosswinds and notes on ice and nothing on faith because people who sign paychecks do not tremble at the same frequencies machines do. I kept my own log on paper that smells like coffee and skydroll, and I put the rule in block capitals on the inside back cover. Do not answer a voice that uses your name. Obey the ones that speak air. If you hear one that sounds like a person you love, climb. If you hear one that sounds like a checklist, listen. Count when you are told to count. Slide when you are told to slide. Never bring your wash into snow that has opinions, and never take credit for somebody under the drift learning to talk. I tucked that page behind a photo of my mentor in a jacket that did not keep any man warm, and a girl I married who did not stay, and a winter that pounded me flat and raised me back up, On clear nights, I sit in the hangar and tip coffee onto the ramp for machines that landed better than they had to, and for call signs the FAA retired, and for voices that have learned to ride the wind like a wire. If you ever find yourself in a cockpit over a white world that hates your depth perception, and the rotor is writing circles in spindrift while the glass tries to convince you the horizon has moved, do not pretend to be alone. Keep guard up. Keep the airframe inside the envelope even as the envelope shrinks. Make your crew chief your conscience and give his hand on your shoulder the authority your pride steals. When a voice arrives over the snow that tells you how the air is behaving without asking you to confess or to turn too soon or to bring your machine into a bowl that wants to be a burial, respect it. When a voice says your name like it has always owned it, climb. When you cannot decide, count. In this state, people freeze to death as often from faith as from weather. I am not here to preach. I am alive because the wind carries speech on winter nights, and because sometimes the dead learn to talk without radios, and because the rotor disc is a translator if you remember manners. On my last flight of the season, with breakup turning drifts into stories and the river spitting ice like pennies, I took the A-star around the nail one more time, and the air over the snow said, "Hold the ridge and slide the tail left," and I did, and saw nothing that required heroism, and landed with no applause and logged it the way we do. Back at the hangar, the bubble fogged and cleared, and my breath made a small cloud against the glass, and carried one faint word back to me from the ramp. Enough. I shut her down and agreed. I shut her. I took the camp job for the money and the quiet. 28 on and 28 off, a bunk in a warm module, 3 hot meals, and the sort of boredom that keeps a man out of trouble. I was an instrumentation hand from the slope down to the middle pump stations, the person they called when a transmitter lied, or a heat trace went stubborn, or the PA stuttered. Winter holds the pipeline the way a vise holds steel. The metal carries its own weather, and the wind around it learns new vowels. On clear nights, the aurora hung above the rack and made the snow glow like a panel backlight. On the bad nights, the world went white, and the only thing that told you where the ground stopped and the air began was the way the generators shook the bunk frame. My first strange night came in Camp M, a long row of connected boxes stilted on steel, the kind of place where you can walk in socks from your bunk to the chow hall and forget for a minute that the outside wants your ears. I woke at 2:13 to a sound that was not wind or boiler or the guy down the hall with a cough he refused to admit. It was a clean triplet knock traveling the length of the corridor above the ceiling tiles. 3 taps paused, 3 taps paused, moving left to right as if fingers ran along the conduit. The sound reached my door, went silent like a person listening, then continued toward the rec room in a gait that did not belong to feet. I lay there counting it and hating that I was counting it, and then I got up because curiosity is a cheaper mistake than fear. In the mechanical room, I popped a panel and saw nothing wrong. The steam lines ran hot and honest. The heat trace glowed in its little eye like a satisfied snake. When I killed the PA to keep the hum out of my teeth, the sound moved into the vent stack and rang like a wrench being flicked with a finger. The camp night watch passed with a clipboard and a grin that said "new guy." Then he heard it, stopped, and did not grin. He said "leave it to the line" and kept walking without meeting my eye. Pipeline camps make their own music, and most of it has reasons. The metal contracts and the bearings sing, and the boilers give up complaints. Guys new to the slope blame spirits for every hiss and then learn to name their enemies like adults. For a week, I put the knocks in that drawer and closed it. The sounds returned every night at the same minute, and then again at 4:06, and they started answering the muster horn drills with a little echo that did not belong to the PA. The horn would wail for our weekly test, and somewhere in the vent run a smaller horn would call back 2 tones too high. We chalked it up to resonance until the PA called my last name in the voice of a mechanic who had choked to death in a mask the year before. He had a little western lilt from a childhood down on the Kenai, and the announcement carried it, speaking the standard muster phrase with the wrong warmth at the end, the same wrong warmth I remembered from the memorial. I walked the racks with a radio, and the radio carried his pattern of breath between syllables and nothing else. The security chief played the logs to humor me and time-stamped the file. The system showed no announcement at that moment. The server had napped for 3 minutes and woken up smug. The night cook, an older Inupiaq woman who treated every man like a grandson until he deserved worse, set a mug of coffee in my hand and told me to stop talking to the vents. She said, "Keep your plugs in after midnight and never answer a voice that uses your mother's name, because the white likes to borrow things that are not nailed down. She said the line will learn you if you let it, and then you will be no use to anybody." Sound travels on colder nights than the mind does. The pipeline sits on H supports and radiates a hum you can feel in your teeth when a pump station brings a unit online. In the clear hours before a storm, the hum carried down the line and across the snow like a rumor. The knocks started to ride that hum, and then outrun it, moving against the wind on nights when the wind decided to erase the concept of up. I heard the pattern skip a mile in a breath and land below the camp's helipad, then show up in the valve yard as if it had always lived there. We logged it as a curiosity for the maintenance meeting, and everybody around the table wrote practical causes to make the page less sad. A welder said frost quakes, and a fitter said support shoes, and a mechanic said IED squirrels. In the corner, the night cook shook her head like a metronome. After the meeting, she told me about the construction years when men threw dice in the modules and kept the radio loud to drown out the calling that started at the pig trap and ended at the far end of the mess hall. She said one winter 3 men followed a muster horn into a drift, and the snow gave them back in April with their zippers up and their fists clenched and their mouths full of nothing. She said the horn that led them did not come off any pole in our yard. Rotations take you up and down the line, and each station has a personality. At Pump Station 7, the compressors sit like quiet elephants, and the control room hates jokes. At 5, the wind refuses to leave the door hinges alone. At 3, the night sky pairs green with blue in a way that gets tattooed into a man's head. I was at 3 the first time I watched the sound move like an animal. We had a vibration transmitter throwing triangles and a pig run scheduled at dawn. The white came in early and made the valve yard a sheet of milk. I set my radio to minimum volume because panic finds louder radios first. I heard the knocks in the stack housing pick up speed when the pig alarm chirped in the control room. The sound traveled from trap to trap with the kind of eagerness that makes dogs look guilty, and then it climbed into the overhead and ran along the H-frames to the dorms like someone tapping a spoon on rail. The PA coughed and made our names in a tone that belonged to no one. Walker, my crew chief from the Hilo outfit who took a few extra shifts to make a mortgage do what it should, stood beside me and said, "Do not answer it if it uses my voice." And I said, "Do not give it that satisfaction." The pig launched into the stream, a beautiful thug of a thing that cleans what men leave behind and teaches 3 stations worth of people to watch gauges like they mean it. The knocks raised a step into a high, quick drumming that threw images into my head I do not like admitting, hands on pipe, fingertips spread, tapping from the inside. I tracked the knock cadence with a pen on my glove and had to stop because the pattern I wrote looked like the mile markers between 7 and 5 in little dots and dashes. I folded the glove into my pocket and told myself a story about coincidence that did not survive long. I started recording the sounds, not because I wanted proof, but because collecting things makes men braver. In my phone, the knocks drew a waveform that leaned the same way the pipeline map did on the wall. I loaded a cheap spectrogram app and the peaks lined up with the compressor run schedule like someone had learned the station's habits and wanted to be included in the work. I brought the files to the control room overnight, and the console operator, a woman who had forgotten how to be impressed 20 winters ago, listened twice and closed the window. She said, "We are not putting that in the incident log because I like my job and I like living more than that." She told me the rule the older hands keep under their hats. Do not knock back in the same pattern. Do not say the word muster unless you are looking at the panel that told you to. Do not cycle a valve for a voice. If you hear your own name from outside steel and glass, get into the generator room and let your ears rest inside a noise that is honest. One night, the whiteout came in with a shove that turned the yard into a thought experiment. We had 2 mechanics in a loader running fuel barrels and a fitter out on a heat trace call, and then we had nobody because the world erased itself. The control room PA barked the muster tones and the panel stayed green. The tones came again from a vent stack over Module C, and the voice that followed belonged to the fitter, except he was standing next to me with his hood off and his mouth shut. Security called on the radio in a voice I did not envy and told everyone to hold in place. The knocks came through the walls in a slow 5-beat that pried at the back teeth. The fitter's face went flat, and he said, "My little brother used to knock like that on our bedroom wall when he had nightmares." I told him to sit down and tie his bootlace, and he tied it like his life depended on a right knot. Somewhere out in the white, the loader bumped a post, and the sound came through the line a second later, as if the pipeline itself had noticed and had an opinion. The PA coughed, and then raised a long tone that would pull a man to a door, even if he had stone for knees. We killed the PA at the rack. The tone continued from the vent. We stuffed rags into the grill like ancestors. In the aftermath of that blow, a story surfaced that turned my stomach. 2 winters back at Pump Station 5, a night electrician heard his name riding the compressor hum and went outside to ask who thought they were funny. He followed the knock pattern down the H-frames and into the yard, and then into the valve alley where the big bodies rest and the little voices amplify. His partner found him 2 hours later, sitting on a support shoe with his gloves off and his hands flat to the steel, the skin on his palms stuck and torn when they pulled him away. He kept saying, "Open me the equalize until morning," and then would not admit a word of it. They transferred him south, and last we heard he works in a store stacking boxes, where the loudest thing is a mop bucket. When the break came, I took my days off without sleeping right. On the flight south, I could still hear the 5-beat knock in the air above the seat row, and when the plane landed in Anchorage, the baggage racks pinged like pipe cooling, and I flinched in a way children notice. Back up the line dark again, I took the first work I could that put me inside stations rather than between them. That is how I ended up at the pig trap at 3 during a run nobody felt good about. A pressure glitch had been flirting with a valve down the line, and the controller in the city spoke in a tone people use when they have options and want you to believe they do not. The storm pinned us in, and I had the trap house to myself when the knocks rose up in the drain header in a steady 575 like a hand on a table trying to teach rhythm to a child. The DP gauge twitched in a way not tied to any panel reading. The radio on my belt snapped and put my father's voice into my ear saying, "Keep your lane, because nobody ever climbs off a bed in a storm because a vent asked them to." He has been dead 6 years, and I am not the kind of man who hears him in any weather. I braced my hands on the vessel and felt the cold of forced steel try to make a home in my bones. The knocks kept the pattern, and then they shifted into the 3-3s that had started my season. I took one step back, then another, until the door frame held me up and the room had the decency to let me breathe without permission. I do not know if you can trap a sound, but I tried. The trap house had a bypass into a dead leg used for maintenance. With the controller's permission, I isolated the leg with 2 blind flanges and set the vent on a manual that does not belong in any night story. I opened the bypass and let pressure equalize and then shut both ends, creating a bubble of cold quiet between valves. The knocks slid along the trap shell and into the bypass, and then tapped themselves into that dead leg and hit the shut metal like a hand meeting a closed window. For a minute, the pattern raced back and forth inside the little length and threw my own breath back at me in the glass. I do not pretend this makes sense. The leg vibrated like a tuning fork. Then the vibration stopped. Then the vent stack above the roof sang a few thin notes like a whistle around a glove finger and fell still. Outside, the white kept its promise to erase the world. Inside, the pig annunciator stayed green because work is work and ghosts do not write to panels. After the storm, the long triplet became a visitor rather than a tenant. It passed some nights and accepted that I would not admire it from a doorway into nothing. Down the line at 7, a young hand answered a muster echo with the phrase, "Come in," and had to be held by his collar while the door handle shivered under no finger. He learned the rule the way most of us do, the hard way once and then never again. In Chow, the night cook put a bowl in front of me and said the pipeline talks because men taught it language when they built it. She said we put our names into the frame rails with Sharpies, and our breaths into the vent stacks and our stories into the PA because stories are cheaper than silence. She said the metal will never forget, and the wind likes to reorganize what it keeps. She told me to write what I had learned in a place no one official looks, and she slid the grease pencil down the table like a receipt. At the pig trap, I opened the maintenance panel and wrote the only 2 helpful sentences I own. Do not answer the vent if it uses your name. Do not operate a valve for a sound. On my last rotation before breakup, the sky went soft and kind, and the nights shortened, and you could smell moisture the way you smell relief. The knocks thinned like a habit a man realizes is not earning him friends. I walked the H-frames when the air was calm and put my ear to the steel, the way you listen to a door for weather. The pipeline hummed the song it always hums when work is honest. Somewhere down the line, a compressor came online and a pressure wave moved like a polite train. When the night got still enough to hear my own heart, without the help of generators, I swear I heard a voice over the snow that did not want anything from me. Say, keep your lane, in a tone that felt like a blessing, and then the wind took it and made it sound like nothing at all. If you find yourself up there in a module built to keep your blood where it belongs, and the vent stack taps a pattern you know in your bones, and the PA speaks in a voice you love that belongs to a person who does not live at your camp anymore, you will have choices. Make the ones that keep you under a roof. Keep the earplugs the cook handed you within reach, and learn which noises tell the truth. When you must go out, clip to the rope between modules and carry your light low and keep your shoulder toward the line rather than your face, because it is polite to look away from a thing that wants your attention. If you work a trap house and a knock tries to teach your hands a pattern, open no steel without a panel's permission and do not play drummer with it, because playing back is the same as saying yes. If a muster horn calls in clear weather and the panel stays green, eat your eggs and drink your coffee and let the horn sing itself out. If you cannot stand it and go to the door anyway, a friend will have to pull you back by your coat, and you will owe him more than money. The pipeline talks, and the camps listen, and the wind edits the conversation. I still work the line when I can, because a man should earn what he eats, and the metal pays in a currency I know. Some nights the knocks run the length of the yard, as if on a little patrol, and I tip my mug toward the vent and keep my mouth shut. Some nights the PA coughs a dead man's cadence, and I say no thank you under my breath, and the world lets me finish my shift. On my day off, I sleep in a town where the loudest thing is a plow at dawn, and I wake anyway at 2:13 and listen to a room that does not owe me sound. Then I go back because the work makes sense, and the rules are written in steel and wind, and that is a language I can obey without lying to myself about anything. The call came over Channel 1 with the small crackle that tells you a man is talking through cold. I was in the clinic's back room stacking boxes of gloves because our volunteer schedule does not care if you slept, and the radio on the wall barked alive with a voice I knew from the school board and the post office line. Tyler said he was 9 miles out on the river trail, just past the Willow Bend where the water finds a new argument every spring, and he said there was something white standing out beyond the drift watching him. I keyed my handheld and told him to describe what he meant, and he said it was tall and had the wrong edges, and that the snow around it looked too smooth. Before I could ask if he wanted someone to ride out, he said it took a step and the wind moved, and then he laughed the way a man laughs when he hates the sound his breath makes. The carrier cut. I waited for the half second that separates fear from paperwork, then I hit the village roll call. 2 machines spun up before I grabbed my helmet. The air outside had that dry sting that turns your teeth into instruments. The sky was a pale slate, and the river flats threw their flat light into my eyes, the way winter teaches men to be careful for free. I met Walker by the fuel shed as he lashed a litter onto a sled, and the old guard taped a flare kit to the seat with the care of a man who has learned which superstitions to call safety. We marked our names and our direction on the chalkboard by the clinic door because everyone in town had learned to keep score after ice taught us in a bad year. The trail ran straight like a thought you do not want to make complicated. Snow had drifted in the cut banks and the willows wore their frost like brittle hair. 2 miles out, the wind lifted and sat down without warning, a cat moving in the room you cannot see. Walker took the lead and I followed in his track because a second machine knows its place. At mile 6, the flats opened, and the only texture belonged to our own skis. I tried Tyler again and got a short carrier, and then a sound like a hand on a drumhead. Walker raised a glove and we idled. The world offered no noise to admire. When we came to the willow bend where he said he was, we found his sled upright and humming with the patience of new oil. His jacket lay rolled on the seat the way you do when you only mean to step a few paces. A glove sat on the snow beside the runner with the fingers curled like they had opinions. A single set of boot prints took a straight line from the machine to the open flats and then stopped. They did not thin the way a sprinter's do. They did not wander like a drunk's. They stopped as if the man who made them had set one foot down and decided to be finished with walking forever. Beyond the last print, the snow lay clean to the horizon. Walker killed the machine, and the sudden quiet made my guts consider religion. He walked the line with a ski pole, probing ahead like a blind man who knows he is being watched. The wind made a small decision, and the snow brushed over the last impression with a gentle hand. I have seen moose tracks fill in faster. I have seen drift swallows. I have never seen snow choose to undo a man's path with such neatness. We did what people do when they want to keep their brains. We backed up, marked GPS we did not trust, set a flag at the last print, and made a wide circle as if to embarrass whatever rule had been written here. Our machines left 2 firm arcs around a space that did not want to serve human curiosity. We cut the engines and listened. Somewhere down the river, the ice complained like a door hinge under a body too long. The willows ticked against one another, in a measure that belonged to no song I knew. Walker raised his goggles and blinked and said, "There is something wrong with the light." I looked where he was not looking because a man who has hunted knows how to respect another man's animal instincts. Out past our circle 100 yards or more, the flats carried a patch of brightness that did not belong to the sky we stood under. It was not a glare ice window or the sheen you see when wind polishes a plate. It was a shape of white that ignored the cloud and the angle and the rules that let pilots land on rivers in April. It was taller than me and longer than any living thing on the flats, and it had edges that learned every time I tried to hold them. When I kept my eyes on it, it stood. When I glanced away and back, it was nearer by a step that I could not prove. The snow around it held no shadow and no track. Walker pointed past my shoulder to give me permission to admit what I was seeing. He said, "Do not say it," and I understood because naming things is a kind of invitation in this country. We called the radio again because men keep trying to save their own ideas. The dispatcher at the post gave me a calm that sounded like someone standing up while they talk. She said a trooper was 2 hours out and to hold if we could. She asked if we had eyes on Tyler. I said we had his machine and a line of tracks that ended and a shape we were not going to describe on a recorded line. She did not laugh because people in her chair have learned to live with poor data. Walker suggested we send the sled back, and I argued with the part of me that loved commandments. We did not need the litter yet. We did need extra eyes. So we called into town and 2 more volunteers came with a rope coil and a memory of rope games. No child in Anchorage learns anymore. When they arrived, we tied on like men in a crevasse field and began to move in a line toward where the tracks stopped. The rope slid over snow with the same soft sound our hearts were making. The white figure remained where it had chosen to be when we started looking straight at it. When we glanced back at the sled or the willow line or the idiot comfort of the chalk flag we set in our circle, the figure had changed its mind and cut the distance by a fraction without announcing its travel in footprints. The rope kept us from making several kinds of mistake. It did not keep my eyes from doing what eyes do in flat light. I blinked too long because the wind let a grain find my tear duct. In that blink, I felt the air warm on my cheek, like a breath that had always known me. I opened my eyes, and the white was closer than it had any business being. It stood inside the arc we had cut with our skis. It did not throw shade onto our machine tracks. It had learned the outlines of a human height and a human width, and then refused to honor them with any details the brain would classify as face or hand. One of the volunteers, a kid whose uncle taught him to drive marsh buggies before he learned to read a map, said it is only light, and I wanted to love him for his audacity. He reached into his jacket pocket and came out with a tin of Copenhagen because some habits survive weather better than others. Without ceremony, He pinched out a black crescent and snapped his fingers until the tobacco spread like pepper onto the snow between him and the white. The black flakes made a stipple that showed the very suggestion of a leg, if a leg were made by someone who had read about legs without having seen one. It was a column without shape, until you gave it texture. The kid whispered sorry in a tone I will never forget. The white leaned toward the peppered patch, and the flakes slid sideways across the crust like iron filings running away from a magnet, and then there was nothing again between us but the color men write on flags when they want surrender. I remembered something my mother's cousin told me when I was young enough to judge adults. He said, "Do not count people out loud in a storm, because the wind will try to help. And it does not count like we do. Do not name the number of nights you have been lucky, or the number of steps you think you have left. Do not describe the thing you can only see with the corner of your eye, because it will take your numbers and make them true." I kept my mouth shut and my eyes half on Walker's shoulder and half on the blur ahead. He told the kid to put the tin away before he created a diet we could not afford. We took 3 slow steps and the blurred white retreated a pace as if insulted by our refusal to play State the Shape. I wanted to turn my headlamp on to force a shadow, and I did not, because flat light is a trickster and shadows in a white world can be a kindness or a lie. We began to talk, not to the thing but to one another, a constant accounting of small true facts that would make no sense in a report and that the wind could not turn against us. Walker said my bootlace is tight and the knot is honest. The kid said my left thumb is colder than my right because I hit it with a hammer last week. I said the rope is smooth in my glove and I can feel your pull, and I am here. Out in the flats, the white shape seemed to lose interest in the game where we imagined we saw features and not just the absence of them. It drifted to the left like a slow piece of cloud snagging on a cutter bar. We turned with it, keeping the rope taut and the distance playful. The volunteers at the sled called out when it moved near them, and the figure never crossed our machine's shadow line. It moved within brightness and refused to learn black. We followed the ghost of Tyler's direction past where his tracks ended. We expected nothing and got less. The snow lay clean in a way that insulted men who have spent their lives reading it. No hair, no seed, no grit, no sparkle that belonged to headlights. There was the sensation of passing through air someone else had recently forced to remember a shape. The white thing paralleled and then drifted forward like a person keeping pace at a polite remove. We reached a shallow dip where the river changes its mind, and a piece of glare ice showed through like a ribbon of coin. I felt hope at seeing any color that was not white or sky. The white stopped at the edge of that darker strip and stood in a way that suggested it could stand for a century and never learn boredom. Walker took one more step, and the ice made the long, low sound it makes when it wants to remind machines who owns geometry. We stopped as if somebody rotated a knob on our brains. I understood the limit as if being taught by a quiet teacher. The white would not cross what reflected, and we should not do it either if we wanted to keep talking. We ventured up the bank through knee-high willow to get around the ribbon and lost sight of the thing. The sudden absence felt like a rope being cut behind my sternum. The snow in the willow windbreak had texture again, and I loved it with the gratitude of a starving man finding breadcrumbs. We paused in the black lace of branches, and I took a breath that did not taste like glass. The volunteers at the sled called to say the white was gone from their view as well. I learned something about how relief can be a liability because my shoulders dropped far enough to let a sound slip past my guard. I heard Tyler on the wind with his wife's Sunday voice saying my name. He has a higher pitch when he is happy, and a lower one when he believes he is being asked to be brave. This was neither. It was the comfortable tone he uses when he has a thermos open and a story in his pocket. I turned my head to where the voice made a map for me. Walker caught my sleeve with a fast hand and shook once like a dog. He said, "Do not," and his breath froze in front of his teeth like a little veil. I stared at Walker's collar and named what I could see. 2 stitches on the seam, 1 flake of paint on the zipper pull, 1 hair caught that did not belong to him. The wind tried a second time with Tyler's uncle's voice asking me if I was alone. I said out loud to Walker that my laces were still tight and that I was about to retie them, and the wind lifted toward the willow tops and left us to our small inventory. We came out of the willow into the next flat, and the white had moved ahead in the way clouds move across a sky that does not believe in wind. It stood at the far edge of a shallow bowl, where the snow had drifted smoother than a floor. In the center of that bowl, a dark oval had opened in the crust, no larger than a sleeping bag, and in that oval lay Tyler's other glove, with a torn wrist and a thin black scuff like something had dragged from the glove to the lip and then had changed its mind about weight. I hated the glove and loved it at once. It was a thing belonging to the world where friction and loss and fingerprints matter. The white stood beyond the bowl like a doorman with no face. We did not step into the bowl. We skirted it like men do when a patch of earth looks newer than it should. I took a knee at the rim and reached with the ski pole and touched the glove. The pole tip came back clean. The glove did not move. Under the crust, the snow had the packed feel of a place that has held pressure too long. I flipped the glove into my hand and let Walker take it. The white leaned toward us as if curious about our crude borrowing. The kid said we could spread coffee grounds to make the thing show itself. And then his own thought scared him because sometimes seeing a thing ruins your idea of how to step away from it. We did not throw coffee. We did throw sand from the ice kit onto the bowl's surface in a fan, and I watched the grains stop and hold their place in a pattern that made no sense if the bowl was simply a depression. It was a lid. It was the top of a shape that was not made by water or wind. I am not claiming a hole. I am claiming that the snow there had learned to be threshold instead of weather. We did not test it. I took the glove and pushed it into my jacket, because people who work in the bush like to give back objects to families even when the conversation around them is made of ridiculousness. The white drifted left and left again as if testing our attention. When we did not follow it into the far white because my rope said no and my chest said no, it tilted as if offended. I watched it consider us the way we consider weather maps. Then it turned toward town. It did not turn with shoulders or hips or any part of a thing that ever walked. It oriented. It began to recede without showing how. For a long minute we were all the same, no moving objects in a medium that prefers movement. Then I felt the rope tighten because the kid had taken a step after it like a new dog after a freight train. Walker hauled him back with a jerk that taught him a lesson without charging him bone. The white paused farther out as if the rope had offended it on a level that belongs to physics and not pride. It resumed toward the river bend and the trail back to people. You will not be shocked that we did not try to stop it. We are helpful men, not heroes. We brought Tyler's sled back with the engine finally agreeing to be quiet. We left flags at every not-quite place we found for the trooper and the ranger and the rest of the community that has learned to ritualize grief. The rope went on the nail by the clinic door, with a new twist in it, where Walker snatched a kid back from his own ideas. We handed the glove to Tyler's wife without saying anything, and she pressed it to her face, and then handed it back because some things should not be domestic objects. The trooper took our statements and wrote them in a way that would not embarrass his supervisor. The dispatch kept the line open for 2 nights on the hour, just in case a voice wanted to learn manners. It did not. We held search lines with men who have earned the right to be wrong. We found nothing else but the memory of where men had stood. The white kept its distance at the edge of town for a week, like a curious animal. At dawn, if you looked past it and named coffee mugs and truck tailgates and the 6 nails in the school's ramp, it stayed far. If anyone stared straight at the place where it wasn't and told themselves they saw arms, it took the courtesy of coming closer. We learned to keep talking in plain inventory when we walked between buildings in flat light. We said the color of doors and the count of shovels and never the number of men on a crew. We set charcoal dust in a tin by the clinic door for any person who wanted to toss a pinch down to turn white into something with an outline if they had to. Usually, we did not. Spring moved north like a rumor and the river throes convinced the ice it had better leave. The white stopped visiting town as often because the world carried too much shadow for it to be greedy. I still hear Tyler on the radio sometimes when wind tries a new corridor through the willows, but I'm not mad at my own ears. Sound is a creature in this country, and it eats where it wants. When I go out at night in winter now, I keep a pocket of coal dust in my parka and a rule where my lizard brain can grab it. Do not count people out loud in a white world. Do not name what the light will learn to wear like a coat. Keep a hand on a rope and an eye on a dark thing that belongs to human life. If a voice calls you by your wife's Sunday tone or your father's after-supper joke, tie your bootlace and describe the knot instead. If you must look toward the brightness that has the wrong edges, blink on purpose and let it become a smear until your heart picks a speed you can afford. The trooper filed it as a missing person. The ranger wrote weather as cause because that is the honesty the state can afford. And the rest of us wrote our names on the chalkboard every time we left town for a trail that opens into a page with too much white on it. We still bring men home more often than not. We still refuse to teach the wind our numbers. We still see something across the flats on a certain kind of day and do not point at it. When I think about the last print at the end of Tyler's line, I remember how clean the snow around it was, and how fast it volunteered to be cleaner. Then, I go back to inventory. One rope nail at the clinic door, one tin of dust, one radio that likes to pretend it is a wind instrument, one rule I have earned the right to keep. The night the lights learned my name, the sky over the river looked like cold fire stretched between poles. Only it is Alaska, and we do not own poles tall enough to hold what came down. The day had stayed at 20 below, and the stars came on early with that cut glass clarity that makes a man feel honest whether he wants to be or not. No AA had promised a geomagnetic storm, and the village kids turned their phones to the northern sky because everyone wants proof. Though the first proof is the sting on your teeth when you breathe and your breath tries to climb back in. I had the key to the school gym and to the science lab because I teach enough biology to be useful and enough shop to fix the door that swells in January, and I had a thermos that kept coffee exactly long enough to raise false hope. The elders wag their fingers about whistling at the aurora, and the kids laugh and whistle anyway until someone older tells the story that makes them stop. The story changes with the teller, but the rule stays the same. Do not call it. Do not point with your full hand. Do not show teeth like a challenge. I used to smile and say the charged particles do not care about a mouth, and now I am careful with my lips when the sky turns green. The first faces arrived as a parlor trick inside the usual physics. Curtains billowed from the northeast and then rippled south and overhead, bright enough to paint the snow in moving moss-colored stripes and bring up red along the lower edges like embers under birch bark. The banding tilted and folded, and for a second I caught what my brain insisted was a cheekbone. I blinked and it was gone, and I told myself about pareidolia, because I love the way that word lets a teacher keep control. Then the curtains parted in a long vertical tear, and the tear rounded into an oval and two denser knots formed inside where eyes would want to be, and my mouth made a sound I am not proud of. Around me, the kids with their phones said, "Wow," and then said nothing because we are not stupid once the newness passes. The oval held, the knots brightened, and the band above it bent like a brow lowering. The shape turned, which is not a thing light is supposed to do, and looked toward the river where the old dock posts lean under snow. The entire village reservoir of bravado evaporated into the cold. I started counting out loud because counting turns fear into chores. I named the constellations left of the phenomenon and the exact distance to the nearest warm building. I told the kids to keep their heads down and their collars up and to follow me to the gym because the gym has no windows and the generator loves the sound of its own voice. A girl named June, who does not scare easily, said the face on the left looks like my grandma, and then shut her mouth because she had broken a rule I did not know how to articulate yet. We hustled to the gym in a knot of boots and steam and the kind of silence that is sometimes more orderly than a command. Inside, the night watch flipped on the sodium lights, and their hum made the building feel less like a mouth. I checked my VHF out of habit and got only a steady hiss that passed for weather, while the lights shook the ionosphere into some new idea. We counted heads, took off too many outer layers because adrenaline is stupid, and I told the kids a safe version of science until our area code felt like a talisman. I went back outside after warming the smaller ones and posting 2 older students by the door with a rule that no one opens for anyone they love without a second pair of eyes. I told myself to log the KP index on a sheet like a real teacher. I told myself the elders' stories were about respect, not outcomes. The aurora had climbed higher, and the faces had multiplied into a loose procession that crossed from east to west like masks on a rail. Some were too large to believe, and some were the size of a house window. None of them were still. They turned like fish in a current. Where the green was thin, the red brightened along a lip line as if oxygen itself had opinions. I saw the outline of my father in one, and the curl of my mother's hair in another, and understood that memory is a tool the sky can steal. I turned back toward the door because work improves a man's lifespan. An elder stood by the gym ramp in a parka older than our school and said, "Keep your head down and your mouth small and do not let it learn you." She did not smile. She tapped the iron railing with her mitten like a metronome turning on. The trouble started when radios failed in the way that makes you feel watched, even inside. The village agent at the airstrip called the clinic on a landline and said 2 snow machines had not returned from the fish house and asked us to raise them on Channel 1. We tried, and the white took our voice and gave us our own names back drawn out like old rope. Another call came in from the far end of town that a little boy was missing, and then not missing because he had been found in his yard, staring straight up with his mouth open like children do at their first snowfall. His mother could not close his jaw. She had to rub his cheeks with her bare hands in the air until he swallowed. And then he shook himself and started to cry, and then to laugh the way relief and fear mix when you are 6. We brought him to the gym and put him under the bleachers with a blanket and gave him a whistle I took away again, because whistling belongs to a superstition I can afford now. Back outside, the faces had gathered over the river flats where steam from open lids writes its own letters. The air tasted metallic, and the snow squeaked underfoot like styrofoam you cannot throw away. I saw a face I recognized as a boy I taught 2 winters ago who drowned at breakup because he loved the first listen of water under ice too much. His mother had braided his hair in the casket, and I had thought then that hair should outlive us. The face smiled the way he used to when he caught me looking at his cheat sheet and pulled his hand off the page like he meant to be caught. I said his name and hated myself for it, and the face brightened in the center and moved 2 degrees lower. Behind me, the elders made a sound in their throats that equals "stay your hand." I put my gloved palm over my mouth and named the iron rail again, and the number of shingles on the gym shed, and the temperature that air hurts, skin the fastest. The face dimmed as if insulted by not being invited. The sky returned fire for every memory we brought to it. Above the clinic, 2 faces formed that matched the sisters who died in a house fire before I came to town, and the younger of the 2 smiled first and opened a mouth that had no teeth or tongue in it, only more green. She turned toward the ridge where the cemetery holds the last known things we have, and I saw the ground there glow pale blue as if light were coming up out of the snow rather than down from the sky. A woman started across the road toward her sisters before the rest of us could calculate the risk, and an elder grabbed her coat from behind with both fists, which is how we save one another here, with a kind of impolite sincerity. The woman snarled wordless anger, and then fell to her knees, and the elder knelt too, and put her forehead on the woman's shoulder, and neither of them spoke for a count of 50. The aurora rose until it was a river overhead with bright nodes lining up like beads on a wire. In those bright nodes, faces formed and dissolved and came back new. They grew clearer when anyone said a full name and blurred when we spoke in inventory. We practiced talking like carpenters and mechanics and fishermen because the sky showed less interest in nouns that served work. We tied ropes between doors and made children walk them with mittens threaded through. We covered windows with tarps and quilted blankets. We turned off every unnecessary light, and the remaining light moved as if relieved to have the village's permission to behave. The generator hummed, and when the aurora snapped brighter, the pitch dipped a fraction, like the machine had heard a thing it could not reproduce. At midnight, the river started talking back. The ice groaned loud enough to make a dog tuck his tail, and the lead edges steamed in columns that carried the aurora downward in a trick of perspective, until you could believe you might touch it if you trespassed by the dock. I walked to the clinic with Walker and 2 elders, because the clinic has a satellite phone, and we wanted to put another voice into the larger world. The sky above us had learned too many faces, and we learned to carry our eyes low and praise denim and boot leather. A shape broke from the main band and slid like silk down 2 points of star. It arranged itself into the oval and set a deeper knot where an eye would be, then bent above into a brow line, and I felt my own brows pull toward it, as if I were making a caricature of myself. Walker said, "Do not mirror it." The elder beside him hissed the same and pushed our chins down like we were boys again. Inside the clinic, the phone worked as long as we kept the handset wrapped in a towel like a superstitious cure. The dispatcher at the hub town took our description and said Fairbanks was seeing something like this, though not with faces, and not with children trying to walk toward sky. She said one elder there refused to let anyone say the word lights and made them say the word weather instead. She said someone in Kotzebue had covered their windows with tinfoil and broken 3 radios, and then said a prayer to an old name no white paper admitted. She asked if we had lost anyone. I said not yet, and tasted the lie because Tyler never did come home, but I would not let the night own him inside the record just then. We went back out with the intention of walking the line between the school and the power plant, because the wire between those buildings is the town's spine. Snow lifted in small sheets, and the faces dipped through them like fish under foam. I saw my father again, though he lives in the lower 48 with a woman who loves southern gardens. The face had his young shape, the one from a photograph my mother kept in a box, and I understood then that the aurora was not stealing only the images of our dead. It was trying on the living as if we were clothes in a trunk. When I kept my eyes on the ground and recited the safety checklist for the woodshop planer, the face dimmed. When I let myself look up, the face made a gesture with its mouth like surprise, and then a smile I had always wanted from the man and rarely earned, and my throat closed, and I almost lifted my hand the way a child does when a big person in a doorway leans down. The elderly woman from the corner house stepped into the alley with a quilt around her shoulders and pointed a full hand at the brightest face and shouted the name she had not said since she buried a son in a box that did not carry enough weight to hold her grief. The aurora whipped over her like a flag. The face tilted as if hearing and then came down lower until the brightness turned the snow around her into a blue negative, and the quilt made a little line of shadow where it draped over her arm. She took a step, and the rope at her waist snapped tight because someone had tied her to the door handle without asking permission. The face kept moving down until it was level with the tallest spruce, and for a second, the needles glowed like the tree had caught a disease only light can spread. The elder beside me began to hum through her teeth, and the sound made my molars hurt, and the face flickered and thinned and moved away as if the sound had convinced it of other business. By 2 a.m, the sky had learned too much about us, and we had learned just enough to survive. We spoke in inventory, and we tied ropes between every door on the riverside of town. We made a rule that no one would say a full name until dawn. We found the 2 missing snow machiners hunkered up in the shadow of a drift, with their backs to the sky and their eyes shut like repentant thieves, and we led them home without breaking that posture. The faces followed until we reached the chain link of the power plant yard and then spread thin and moved along the top like somebody dragging a wet finger around a wine glass. The night watch inside the generator building pounded on the window once with the flat of his hand, and the faces scattered as if offended by being reminded that glass belongs to us. Near 3, while the aurora kept up its river of masks, a little boy got loose from a rope and ran toward the dock because he heard a man calling his dog from his own yard, though the yard was now a theater set for snow. I caught him by the back of his coat and pulled him down, and he screamed, and I covered his mouth with my glove, not to silence him, but to confuse the sky with the wrong shapes. The face above us formed into a copy of the boy with the mouth still open and the teeth drawn in red, not white, and I knew with an adult disgust that the aurora had progressed from impressions to imitations. 2 elders walked backward with the boy between them, while Walker and I kept our bodies turned just enough to see where steel and cord and work lived. The faces did not cross the line of shadow cast by the gym roof because the roof was solid and thrown by a light we owned. At 4, the red faded first, and the green thinned into a gauze you could almost ignore if you had practice. The faces stretched as if bored, and then flattened into bands like the sky had grown tired of detail. When the gray at the edge of the world began to lift a little, I felt my own pulse let go of my throat. I stood on the gym ramp and looked where I had carefully not looked for hours. The aurora retreated north as if rolling a rug toward the horizon. I saw the curve overhead ripple once more with an eye shape and then none, and the low band along the river undulated without any desire to perform faces for anyone. I lowered my gloves and put my hands on the iron rail the way you do when you have owned a night. The elders did not cheer. They stood and watched the sky like an old relative finally going home after a visit that required too much patience. The day that followed was tired and brilliant. We hung quilts back where they belong and thawed our words in coffee and said very little that would make sense to anyone who lives under a sky that minds its own business. The boy's mother patched the hole in the rope with a sailor's knot I knew, and she let me hold the rope long enough to feel the new honesty in it. In class, the older kids did not put their phones on their desks. They asked if we would cover the lab windows with butcher paper, and I said yes and did not explain the science behind anything except how light travels in straight lines until something claims it. That afternoon, I wrote a short policy in my teacher voice and posted it on the gym door under the schedule for open court and the flyer for the hockey fundraiser. It said, "Keep your mouth small on aurora nights. Do not point with a full hand. Do not say any full names. Inventory beats invitation. Tie ropes. Sing if you must and hum if you forget the words." I signed it with my name because weather is not a bureaucracy and we do not need permission to keep each other alive. When the next big storm came through in February, we were ready. The lights ran like wild silk over the ridge and my spine did its small rehearsed panic. Faces formed again and the sky tried fresh masks and we talked about mittens and rails and bolts and the correct wrench for a stuck hinge. The faces made less of us. They still came when anyone said a full name and they still drifted low if you mirrored them with your brows. But we had the rope and the songs and the habit of hum and the iron rail and the kind of stubbornness that looks like superstition until you count survivors. I still do the science talk in September because everything has a reason, and I still keep my mouth small when the sky wears the color of mercury. On the worst nights, I think of the boy whose face the aurora drew almost perfectly, and I compress my lips into a straight line and speak about coffee mugs and door latches, and I let the sky be ancient and uninterpreted. If you ever visit and the lights come down bright and you feel that excellent first joy, clap your hands into your armpits where your breath cannot see your teeth and keep your compliments for the morning. The aurora will not mind. It is busy wearing what we let it take. The day we lost the bus, the sky looked honest in that hard Alaskan way that makes tourists trust it and guides suspicious. Clouds sat like flat stones above the Alaska range, and the light laid a clean hand over the braided rivers. I had 7 people in my care, 2 retirees from Ohio who wore new rain shells like armor, a teenage boy whose mother had promised bears as if they could be scheduled, a photographer from Georgia already in love with the word tundra, a newlywed couple collecting parks like stamps, and a veteran riding his luck in the quiet after 3 loud deployments. We had just eased through Polychrome Pass with the cliffs showing their stripes like geologic bragging when the bus coughed once and took offense at the idea of going uphill one more time. The dash threw a soft red the color of embarrassment. I radioed dispatch and got a wall of static that sounded like wind trying to learn English. The driver and I did the ritual that sometimes scares machines into behaving. He killed her, counted to 30, turned the key like a priest, and the engine answered with only dignified silence. We were at mile 68 with no cell service and a sun that would pretend to last forever until it did not. I keep rope, a med kit, glow sticks, and an aluminum bear box of small miracles behind the second row because Denali's backcountry forces a guide to be dull in ways that save lives. The plan was simple and felt heavy in my mouth. We would take the footpath along the shoulder where the park road clings to the slope until we could top a low ridge and drop into a draw that leads to the Toklat River pullout. From there, we could wait for a green shuttle or a ranger unit if the radio decided to remember its job. I gave the talk I always give when we step off a bus into a place that looks like a painting and behaves like a machine. Stay tight. Keep your voice low. If you see a bear, talk like you want to negotiate a treaty. Do not run unless I run, and I do not run unless the ground is on fire. The boy grinned like rules had just sworn allegiance to him. The veteran nodded once and checked the way his new boots creased. The Ohio couple squeezed each other in a way that made me hope their trust had more lives than a cat. We hadn't made 200 yards before the world changed its mind about weather. Fog came in from the west like a tide that refused to be water. 1 second, the ridgeline was a clean jaw under a sharp hat. The next, it was a suggestion. And the next after that, the bus behind us had become an idea I wished I had written down. The wind died the way a room goes quiet when someone says the wrong name. Sound flattened. The photographer raised her lens and lowered it without taking a shot because lenses lie in fog, and she had the decency to let art be honest. I keyed the radio again, and it answered in a patient hiss. The newlyweds murmured about how beautiful it all was, and I felt something old and practical move behind my ribs in a way I have learned to trust. I pulled the group close and threaded my rope through belt loops and pack straps until we were a polite human centipede. The boy smirked. I told him every serious backcountry person is a believer in rope even when they pretend to be a cowboy. He stopped smirking because cowboys also believe in not being the first to disappear. We moved. Dwarf birch brushed our knees like old hands. Ground squirrels chirped from their windows and decided we were not worth their tails. A raven crossed our path so close I felt the air tug in its wake. Far below, the toklat carried its gray silt like secret paperwork. The fog thickened until even the braided river turned into a smear. That was when I heard the first whisper. It came from my left, where the slope falls in a polite shrug toward willow and water, not the wind. Wind makes one letter and pushes it into everything. This had breath in it, a human friction inside the sound, and it used my name with a familiarity that made my spine consider standing still forever. It said, "Keep the road edge at your hip and count 12. I stopped, because stopping is sometimes the only way to keep mind and muscle married. The group bunched, and the rope tightened against my hip. The veteran said quietly he heard it too. The Ohio woman blinked slow like a person whose brain is writing 2 stories at once and trying to decide which one is worth ink. I have heard the stupid things people do when the land speaks, and I have found 3 of them with my own hands. They answer. They follow immediately. They say I know a shortcut. I did none of those. I spoke work into the air because work is a language land respects. I said we will set compass. We will go 12 paces because 12 paces also belongs to maps, and then we will stop and ask the river what it thinks. We went 12, and in the fog, we found the fringe of gravel that means the road shoulder has decided to become a slope. 2 more paces and one of us would have achieved acceleration we could not negotiate with. The whisper had directed us not toward salvation, but away from a mistake. It had used my name, and I hated it for that intimacy. I told the group a true thing that did not betray the totality of the moment. The shoulder drops quick here. Keep hands on the rope and your weight over your feet. The boy tried to joke, and the veteran pinched his sleeve with 2 fingers to let him know that joking could be expensive if bought at the wrong register. We continued with the rope sliding over palms and knots, singing in little complaints. The fog breathed in and out like a sleeping thing whose chest we were afraid to rise on. Somewhere above us on the slope came a clatter that belonged to rock and not to hoof. The Ohio man whispered, "Bear," and I said rockfall and felt the relief that comes when one hazard replaces another you like less. The next voice came as we started down into the draw, softer than the first, and said in a female mouth I almost recognized. It lived at the edge of my childhood, in the vowels my mother gave me when she was trying to be brave and cook at the same time. "Do not cut the switchback," it said, and the hair on my forearms rose under 4 layers, as if hair cares nothing about insulation. I stopped again, and I looked at the slope where the game trail teased us with economy. I have taken that short line when weather is calm and visibility generous, and it is a cell. In fog, it becomes a chute to the creek bed that loves knees the way ravens love trash. We stayed on the switchback, and my gratitude made me angry, because I do not like thanking things I cannot see. Half an hour later, the brush closed in with willow that grabs ankles like a bad memory. The draw funneled the fog into a thicker shape that turned the world into a hallway. The newlywed man said his name out loud by accident because he wanted to share a stupid observation with his wife, and the whisper took it and tried it on. It spoke his name back in his own voice and attached a command to it that made me want to put gloves over his mouth. Step over the log, and you will find the riverbed. We all stood because maps teach patience if you let them. There was no log. There was a false bench cut into the slope by the slow trickery of meltwater, and stepping over it would have set his ankles on a ride to the creek. The veteran said softly from the back, "Never follow anything that uses your name." I made it a rule out loud. If you hear your name, you repeat inventory. You say the color of your jacket or how many knots between you and me, or the smell of the willow. The group began to murmur those small facts the way prayers taste in the mouth of someone who is prepared to bargain. We reached the braided river in a gray that had dignity without favor. The Toklat lay wide and shallow in most places, split into fingers braided tighter than a mother can manage on a child who wants to run. The sound of it came up through my boots like electricity, training me to be humble. You do not cross a braided river by trusting any one channel. You test, you tow, you learn the language of silt. The photographer froze at the edge because the push of water even at her ankles carried a tone her bones had not studied. The boy wanted to leap the first shallow line and prove something, and I put the rope through his belt a second time to insult that idea. We formed a line and took the water in angles, never straight on, always toward the gravel bars that high-centering hopes collect. The first whisper that night spoke again and told me to aim left, where the current darkened, and I answered the only way I trust. I said the water is colder than my hands can confess. My pants are wet to mid-shin, the gravel is coarse, and the bar I want is shaped like a boot heel. We angled right. The left carried a silt trough that would have welcomed us and left us. The veteran felt it with his stick and shook his head, and I nodded because agreement can be a sacrament when you are choosing not to drown. Halfway across, someone started crying in a voice that was not a person. It sounded like a child who has been promised something at a store and then denied it. It came from the fog just upstream. The Ohio woman looked toward it, and I said strictly eyes on the bar, and she obeyed because some people love rules the way they love clean sheets. The cry shifted into a language I did not understand, and then into English with an accent like mine, and then into a voice I knew well and loved. My brother's voice asked me why I had not shown him this place sooner, and my toe slid on a rock, and I paid for that moment with my shin. The pain saved my life because it made the world immediate and specific. I said aloud, "My shin hurts, and the rock is shaped like a potato, and the water is a liar." The whispers fell back for a breath like a wave reconsidering a shore, and then came again from a new angle and asked the newlywed if he wanted to see the bear he had flown north for. The veteran said the bear does not need your attention, and the newlywed laughed once like he had remembered birthdays, and went back to watching the rope. We made the center bar and took a knee all together in a way that made me believe humans contain the ability to synchronize hearts without asking. The fog thinned for one count and returned. On that bar, we found a caribou track going the direction we preferred. If you have not followed caribou, you might not know that they save energy the way accountants save pennies. They do not waste steps. They find the easiest path through weather, and they keep it through generations. In Denali, you do well to borrow their maps. We put our boots in their dimples and let our weight sit in their choices. The whispers learned this quickly and took on a new tone that I hated more than the intimate one. They sounded helpful. They suggested small corrections that would have put us into side channels that deepened to waste and then to second thoughts. I said no aloud, like it was my first word, and the Ohio couple repeated no as if it were a physical object they could hold. The boy counted the dimples between him and me because math gets us places magic only promises. On the far bank, the fog changed again. It lifted just enough to make silhouettes, and then held as if the weather had decided to tease. In that gray, we saw shapes at the ridge top that wanted to be people watching us. They had the right heights and the right stances, and then they would bend wrong at the hip, or the head would lag behind the turn the way a coat on a hook lags when you spin it. The veteran murmured that he had seen sirens in other countries, and I said quietly that we would keep our eyes on ground truths. He said ground truth saved him once in a street where walls lied, and I told him to tell me about it when we were not in a class. The whispers from the ridge came down like small stones, and each one had weight. They used the names of towns we knew, and the sound of our own shoes on the gym floor back home, and a particular cough from a school hallway, and a laugh from a person we had said goodbye to last year. The newlywed woman stumbled even on dry ground, and I caught her by the elbow, and she said it sounded like her grandmother calling her in from the yard. I said, "We are all in from the yard now," and we keep walking. We regained something you could call a trail, where the tundra climbs a little onto a ridge that looks east toward Alaskan when the weather is cooperative. We had zero cooperation, but the land still knew how to hold our feet. The rope eased. Our steps found a rhythm that matched something older than fear, and the boy stopped testing the knots with his nervous hands. The whispers quieted like a room when an authority leaves. In that quiet, we heard the soft clack of caribou somewhere past the fog, the click of tendons over joints, and the careful blow of breath in air that wants to shatter it. We all froze without orders because the wild can make a choir out of cynics. After a while, the herd moved off, and the fog carried their heat like a rumor. The photographer took a picture of the fog itself, because she had learned what to love that hour. When the road appeared, it did not appear as a strip of human logic. It presented itself as a slightly wrong line in the moss, a suggestion of gravel under willow, a smell of dust that had been suppressed by weather and now wanted to confess. We stepped onto it with the incoherent gratitude people feel when stepping back into a language they can swear in. The rope sagged. The Ohio woman pressed her face into her husband's shoulder. The boy said nothing for the first time in 2 hours. The veteran closed his hand and opened it twice like he was tightening a bolt. Down the road, a green shuttle materialized out of fog like a memory choosing to be kind. I raised both poles in the international sign, for we are not dead, and the bus stopped because drivers on that road know the difference between a wave and a report. We piled in and steamed the windows with our ugly human relief. The driver did not ask for explanations. He looked at my rope and at the wet line on our shins and at the dirt I had not noticed on my cheek, and he put the bus in gear, and the engine behaved like a good dog. Not because it was a dog, but because engines sense when men need them to be gentle. Back at the Toklat contact station, the radio decided to admit we existed. I filed a report without the words "wind talking." I said fog, path, braided river, human factors, group managed. I drank coffee that had been burned to a seriousness I appreciated. The newlyweds held hands like they had learned something married people usually take years to understand. The veteran wrote a phone number on my map with a line that said, "If you ever need to talk without being a guide." The photographer showed me a picture taken by accident while she braced on the rope. It was all fog and the hint of a ridge and a shape above that I cannot prove was anything but cloud, a suggestion of a line where a brow would be and a curve that wanted to be a mouth. She asked if she could delete it in front of me. I told her she could do what made her ribs feel less tight. She put her thumb on the trash and did not take it off until the screen changed. On the ride back through polychrome, the fog stayed, and the voices went quiet the way bears do when the wind shifts against them. The Ohio man asked if he had imagined the first whisper, and I said, "Imagination is a tool that keeps us alive, and sometimes it comes preloaded with stories the land would like to borrow." He laughed with a softness I had not heard when he wore a career that insisted on control. The boy asked if I believed in ghosts, and I said I believe in rules and in caribou trails and in the kind of weather that learns your name if you offer it a mouth. He said he would tell his friends, and I asked him to leave out the parts that make kids chase fog. I did not sleep well that night in the guide dorm. The wind pushed at the siding and the mountains pushed back with stone, and in that argument I heard my name once more, whispered in the timbre of a person who had taught me to tie knots and then died of a thing no rope could fix. It told me to keep my lane and to count in work rather than in fear. I lay there with my eyes open until the window lightened into whatever passes for morning this far north. In the cafeteria, I found the veteran, and we drank bad coffee, and he told me the story from another country about a place where walls speak, and he said the rule there had been the same. Do not answer if it uses your name. Do not follow a kindly voice. Count the bolts on the door and the bends in the pipe. Trust the path made by animals that do not care whether you bring a camera. If you come to Denali for the mountain and find fog instead, if your bus dies in a pass whose name is a promise about color, if a voice in the willow tells you to save time, you can choose how much of your life you would like to spend in someone else's story. Tie the rope. Count the steps. Speak inventory. Step where the hooves stepped. Keep the road edge at your hip when the world erases the road. If your name comes back to you in your own voice from a mouth you cannot see, make your mouth small and talk about the knots. The mountain does not care. The river will not remember. The whispers might. On better days, I hope they were trying to keep us from mistakes. Because something older than snow has a ledger it would like to keep light. On worse days, I think they were hungry. Either way, we walked out together, and the bus warmed like a patient animal, and the fog let us take a stretch of road before deciding to teach another group how to count. I was running the inside of the Sound because the forecast had turned sour, and the outside swell had a role that teaches humility whether you asked for class or not. The morning was the color of pewter, the kind of gray that flattens distance and makes rain and fog wear each other like borrowed coats. The tide line had a ragged edge, and the gulls had taken their gossip somewhere else. I had a net to mend, and a list from the processor longer than any list should be this close to the end of the season, and I had already told myself twice that the day would be ordinary because sometimes ordinary will agree if you ask politely. I saw the boat a mile off just north of a rock that has taken more props than the bar in Cordova has stories. She rode strange. No drift net out. No hook lines. No men on deck. The wheelhouse windows showed the milked reflection you get when a stove is working in a damp cabin. I called a hail on 16 and got only my own voice pretending to be patient. I tried again with the boat's name once I could read it under the salt. Mariah Jane. No answer, no wave, no irritated deckhand telling me to mind my own set. The current wanted to push her toward the rock, and I am not the sort of man who watches a vessel kiss stone to keep his day clean, so I powered up alongside, took a line forward and aft, and brought her head around with my stern dragging like a stubborn dog. Salvage rights crossed my mind because the sea does not reward poetry as much as it rewards paperwork, but the feeling behind my ribs had more to do with respect than with money. I put us in the quiet lee, threw fenders, and climbed over. The first thing was heat, not summer heat, galley heat. The kind that smells like onions, that have behaved themselves in butter and coffee, that has decided to be honest. The wheel was midships, the autopilot off, the throttle at idle, the radar on standby, the chart plotter tracing a slow curl that did not match the tide or the mind of any man I know. 4 bowls sat on the galley table with spoons nested like the meal was an intermission. A pot on the stove gave off a soft tick as bubbles tested the lid. A coffee mug with a chipped lip waited beside the sink with steam giving the lie to any notion of absence. I stood with my gloved hand on the jamb because I was raised by a father who taught me to ask a room if it minded being entered. My hand knew plenty before my mouth did. The deck had the damp grit that comes of men working. The boots by the galley door stood where feet had left them, toes pointing at an angle that said the wearer had meant to return after a smoke. The survival suits hung from pegs in a tidy row like tired men lined up for inspection. A deck of cards was fanned under a rubber band, the ace of spades showing because someone had liked drama. The VHF muttered weather in a flat voice, and then hiccuped a call sign from a station that shut down a decade ago. The clock over the stove ticked. I do not love clocks that tick in a room with no men. I called again into the cabin because a man does not like to be caught talking only to himself. I said hello in a voice meant to be harmless, and heard only the stove add a louder simmer as if the pot had remembered it had a job to do. There was a wallet on the shelf by the radio, leather soft with use, with a picture of a woman and 2 kids tucked into the clear sleeve. The picture had a crease where a thumb had gotten used to it. The logbook lay open on the counter, pen across the spine, today's date written in a heavy hand and nothing else. That was wrong. If a boat is underway at breakfast, there are entries you make before you hear the kettle. I touched the pen with my knuckle like it was a snake, and the page accepted the nudge without complaint. I killed the stove because heat with no owner feels rude. The pot sulked. The steam thinned. The smell of onions learned to be memory. In the engine room, I expected the low honesty of a diesel at idle, and got it. The old John Deere beat time like it had tuned itself to my heart years ago. Oil pressure good, water temp steady, fuel plenty, no leaks, no broken belts, no rag left where a rag should not be. I closed the hatch and stood listening to the space where a crew would be swearing about something useful. The silence made room for a new sound I could not place. A soft rhythmic knock coming from the aft lazarette, as if someone below deck had adopted the habit of clearing their throat with their knuckles. I am not foolish, only stubborn, so I did the things you do when the shape of a day starts changing without asking your permission. I hit the mic and raised the Coast Guard in Kodiak because even men who believe in privacy prefer witnesses. The watchstander answered with her brisk voice, and I gave position, description, status, and the part about the warm galley, as if mentioning it less might make it smaller. She told me to hold if safe, report changes, and keep my own boat secured. In the background, I heard a second voice ask a third for the registry on the Mariah Jane. I felt better for 30 seconds. Then the VHF spoke in a tone I knew too well and hate even now. It was my father's voice, younger than he is now, and from a year when the cod price made men cocky. He said, "Don't turn the stove off, son," and I almost answered because muscle memory is a traitor. My thumb touched the transmit and I took it away like a hand from a hot component. I said inventory instead. Wheel midships. Throttle idle. 4 bowls. Coffee. Cards. Logbook open. Engine good. Lazarette knocking. Saying what is there keeps a man from talking to what he wishes were there. I went aft because knots in my back loosen when I move and tighten when I stand still inside thinking. The knock under the deck matched the roll. Not wood, not metal. It had a fleshy quality to it that made my fists think of tables. I lifted the hatch a hair, and the sound changed in pitch as air made a small agreement with space. I set the hatch back down, because I had no appetite for breaking a rule I had not finished writing. On the back deck, a single hook hung on a short length of line, swinging gently as if in a wind that did not exist on that side of the boat. A pair of work gloves lay palms up on the bait board, as if the hands had simply stepped away. The net tunnel was clear. The stern roller had the clean scrape that says it has done a full day's work and promised another. On the port rail, someone had written a name in salt with a thumbnail, and the letters had the wavering line of a man chatting while he worked. The name was mine. I am not the jumpy sort. I have had enough years out here to be bored by my own fear. I am not ashamed to say that seeing my name written in water, I did not write it with earned the boat half a step of my respect and raised something old inside me that my mother used to call listening. I went back to the galley to make tea because making tea is what you do when you intend to be sensible. The stove lit on the first click, even though I had turned the knob to off. I put a kettle on and did not leave it. The logbook still lay open like a throat. I glanced and saw that a line had appeared under the date in that same heavy hand. It said found by Eli at 9:20. Eli is my name and 9:20 was 5 minutes ago. I set my palm flat on the counter so the wood would know a human was present and watched as the pen twitched once like a tail. The next line wrote itself in strokes a little clumsy, like a child learning to copy. It said he turned off the stew, and then turned it on again, and then crossed out again, and wrote left the stew to cool. It was accurate both times, depending on the version of me I let the stove win. I did not let the stove win. I took the pen and set it in the drawer, and shut the drawer and then opened it to be sure the pen had learned its new rule. It had not moved. The kettle sighed. I poured into my travel mug because this was not a moment for the Mariah Jane's cups. Steam covered the clock face and it blurred into a white circle while the second hand continued to sweep like a shiny lie. I called the guard again, and a different voice answered. An older man with the weary confidence of someone who has heard all the sea's jokes. He said the registry shows the Mariah Jane reported overdue 3 days ago with 3 hands, out of Seward, family notified. I told him the boat was warm, the engine steady, the food cooking like someone had just walked out. He told me to keep off the deck lines and not to take her into gear and to hold for the helo. I did not like the part of me that felt relief that a rotor might write its own rule over the day. I kept one ear on the cabins and one on the deck. The knock in the lazarette quieted and shifted to a soft scrape like fingertips on the inside of a drum skin. The VHF tried again with my father's voice, this time saying, "Stir the pot because it will catch." And a second voice came under his. A younger man with a different region in his vowels, maybe one of the missing, maybe something under that. He said, "We're late and the tide does not wait." The engine note dropped half a key like it had taken a breath to hum along. I turned the key to kill and the engine stayed alive, not defiant, simply disinterested, as if diesel and rack and throttle had gone to a meeting I was not invited to. I went to the panel and threw the battery switch to off, and the lights in the cabin remained steady, and the stove made a cheerful little pop like a child with bubble wrap. My boat alongside tugged at the lines as the tide shouldered us both like a big friend learning to be careful. I told myself the tide had this one free joke and that the rest would obey. Men will tell themselves anything in cabins at sea. I tried the crew cabins forward. Bunks made, personal gear light, no duffels thrown like a rush, no notes pinned that you would write if you meant to break someone else's heart by disappearing. A book lay open face down beside a pillow with a finger in it like a promise. The page had rendered in mirror on the pillowcase in damp ink. In the head, a razor lay with a little clot of hair rinsed to the drain and left as a punctuation. Nothing out of place except the absence of sound that belongs to men. Back in the wheelhouse, the plotter track did an impossible thing. The trace we had just made together curled in and overlapped with a track that had recorded at a time stamped 2 hours in the future, a neat oval that came back to the spot where I now stood. I changed screens and back, and the future remained. I stepped away and the present replaced it, but only when I put my hand on the wheel did the future route return like a dog recognizing its person and jumping up. The radio squelched, and a call sign identified the cutter Samson as if we were playing naval history. The Samson has been scrap since before I had chest hair. The voice announced my position with calm authority and then signed off with a phrase my father used to mutter when he secured from a set, something about the net sleeping with its mouth closed. The way you learn to hate a phrase is to hear it out of the wrong mouth at the wrong moment. I made another cup of tea to force an excuse to stand with my back to nothing. The kettle whistled even though I had not set it back on, and the stovetop gas flame had learned to be tall without my permission. A shadow passed the window in a direction that water does not employ. Boots thumped overhead in the light domestic way that says a deckhand is going to scold you for leaving a rag where someone could step on it. The sound reached the top of the companionway and sat there waiting for me to assign it a set of feet. I did not. I spoke inventory again because the old fisherman I grew up around taught me that knowing the names of objects and their count can hold back a tide of wrongness. Wheel midships, autopilot off, chart plotter lying, VHF lying, engine ignoring, stove overachieving, 4 bowls, 4 spoons, 1 deck of cards, 3 suits hanging, 3 suits not occupied by men. The thumping overhead softened and moved aft with the reluctant courtesy of someone asked to leave. The lazarette knock returned as a thin tap from inside the lower hull, and then in the same rhythm tapped on the galley table under my hand. I removed my hand, and the tapping stopped, and then started on the opposite end of the table as if the boat were saying, "We can talk if you would like to meet in the middle." I do not speak boat. I speak engines and nets and weather and money and the gruff jokes that keep a man away from the softer versions of confession. I did the stupidest thing I have done in years and sat at the table and set 1 bowl in front of me and put the spoon beside it and did not pour anything because my mother raised me well. The tapping stopped. The VHF went to a quiet that had weight. The engine settled into a smoother idle like it had finally chosen a tempo it could live with. The logbook in the drawer moved with a paper whisper even though the drawer was shut, so I opened it because if a thing is going to perform, you may as well let it. The page now had my name written twice, once in the larger hand and once in a tighter script that shared my stubborn letter shapes. The larger hand wrote "sit," and the smaller hand wrote "do not answer." If you think I am embellishing, I will forgive you. I have learned to be suspicious of stories with men who use first person and never admit the possibility of shame. I chose to stand. I took the bowl and nested it with the others and wiped the ring it had left with a towel I had not brought. I walked to the engine room and did what my father taught me to do to any engine that had begun to think of itself as an owner. I pulled the fuel shutoff cable and held it longer than necessary so the habit would be re-educated. The engine slowed and coughed and stopped, and for 1 second the boat leaned exactly the wrong way, as if an exhale had rearranged its bones. The clock over the stove paused, and then insisted upon resuming without me. The silence after a diesel dies in a cabin at sea has a taste. This one tasted like steel and onions and the stale breath of men who laughed on the way out the door. From under the galley's soul came a sound like a spool rolling away somewhere you could never reach. I opened the soul hatch and found the small things that make a boat honest. Bilge water clean, pump weeping at the seal more than I liked, a coil of line like every coil of line in every boat, pretending to be contained and secretly wanting to be elsewhere. In the corner at the bulkhead, someone had wedged a mason jar with a scrap of paper inside, the sort of soft superstition crews indulge in after long weeks without balance. I pulled the jar free, and the paper inside had long ago learned the shape of the glass. I cracked the lid and unfolded the slip and read a list of rules in block letters. Do not leave the stove lit without a man in the room. Do not answer voices on the PA that do not come from the mic. Do not open the lazarette in fog. Do not run the engine when the galley clock is stopped. Do not take food from the pot if you cannot name everyone at the table. There were initials under it, 4 sets, one of which matched the driver's license in the wallet by the radio. I took the jar because some objects asked to be rescued, and I added my own rule with my pencil on the back. Do not say yes to a boat that knows your name. The line above it darkened as if the pencil had agreed. I replaced the jar and shut the soul and stood up into a cabin that had learned another shade of quiet. The logbook from the drawer lay on the counter again, though I had returned it to the drawer twice. The page wrote a new line in the heavier hand, "He will not sit." The smaller hand wrote "good." Outside the cabin, the fog thickened like breath on a window. My own boat tugged at the lines as if it had gone impatient for a human who remembers it. I told the Coast Guard the engine was now secured, and the vessel remained warm and empty. The watchstander said the helo was 15 minutes out, and the cutter would be on scene later if I wanted to let the professionals take the weight. I said I would hold. I said I had put out a sea anchor from my own boat to keep us both off the rocks, and I did it while saying it so the universe would have less opportunity to argue. The footsteps on deck returned and moved toward the stern with the orderly speed of men making ready to set a net. The thumps ran to the roller and the roller squeaked as if a hand had put pressure where only weight should be. The air in the cabin cooled. The condensation on the window ran straight up as if gravity had taken a different job. The VHF raised someone on 1-6 who said my name in the voice of my first deck boss, a man who once kept my lungs inside my ribs by yelling when yelling was love. He said bring her around now, and I did not because he was dead, and because love has a taste and this call did not contain it. I opened my travel mug and poured hot tea into the sink because heat draws attention, and I had decided I did not want attention from the wrong quarters. The kettle went cold without arguing and the flame under it winked out, though my fingers were nowhere near the knob. The boots by the galley door changed angle by 1 degree in the way an object does when it remembers it was involved in a life. Rotor noise comes like a promise even in fog. The helo approached low and cautious, a white belly with orange shoulders moving against a sky that had stopped thinking it was a sky and preferred being fabric. The air from the rotor made the fog behave and pressed it into a pattern that let the deck exist again. The footsteps ceased as if embarrassed. The knock in the lazarette reappeared, then faded, then reappeared, then learned shame. The rescue swimmer came on the radio with that cheerful competence that makes small children decide on careers and asked for a quick brief. I gave it with the details that matter to professionals and left the parts that make men superstitious. He asked if anyone was on board besides me, and I said no. He asked if the vessel was safe to board. I looked at the 4 bowls and the boots and the rules in the jar and the logbook on the counter and said yes with the voice I use when I am lying for the right reasons. He put his feet on my deck and the boat settled the way a dog settles when it likes a particular person. He moved like a man used to being watched by the wrong things, and the engine room did not argue when he looked at it. The guard took custody the way the law likes to say it. We towed the Mariah Jane in under the cutter's patient hip, and the helo returned to a sky that had learned humility. In the quiet of the tow, my own boat rode true and made no fuss, and I sat with my knees up under my chin on the bench by the galley and watched the logbook because I am a fool for patterns. It wrote once more, a single word in the heavy hand that looked weary now, hungry. The smaller hand wrote 3 words, not for you. I closed the book gently and put it into the jar and twisted the lid on and set the jar under the sink behind the bleach and pretended I did not remember doing it. In port, the investigators brought their clean clipboards and their careful faces. They asked my name and how much sleep and what I heard and the precise minute I boarded and the exact temperature of the stew, which I could tell them because onions tell the time if you've cooked enough of them. They asked me to open the logbook and I did, and showed them the last entry dated 3 days prior in the heavy hand describing weather and a net tear and a joke about a seal. The part about me was gone because paper knows when to be loyal. They asked if I had eaten. I told them no, and left out the part about setting a bowl like a man grooming a trap he has decided not to spring. They told me families had been notified again with an updated version of the same story everyone learns when working water. They acknowledged the warm galley and the stubborn engine on the report in a clinical way that allowed for physics and better men than me. The boat sat at the dock and steamed gently from the vents and gave off the odor of a house where a cake just came out of the oven and children have been told to be patient. A pastor walked by and nodded at the bow with the respect one gives a body. An old fisherman I know from way back walked up the ramp and spat into the water and said certain boats get ideas, and we all pretended not to have heard. I still run the sound and the outside when weather and money make the same case. I still keep rope in reach and coffee honest and my logbook boring. When I see a boat riding wrong in fog, I go, because a man should not ignore a vessel when the current is about to make a fool or a ghost of her. I keep a jar under my sink with a piece of paper in it, and when I am alone at anchor, I take it out and read the rules because repetition is a kind of prayer even for men who do not waste prayers. I added one more line after a week of thinking I had learned enough. If a galley is warm and bowls are set and you cannot name every spoon, set one more place and then leave it empty. I do not know whether that line earned me any favors. I know the next time I passed the rock, where I found the Mariah Jane, the water smoothed under my bow as if someone stroked it with a hand, and the VHF did not try my father's voice on for size. The gulls returned to their gossip. The clock in my own galley ticked without lying, and the kettle only whistled when I told it to. Somewhere out there, a boat still makes stew and waits, and the engine hums in a tone that finds the parts of a man who wants to sit down. If you find her, you will have choices. The ocean will not care. The law will use the words it can manage. The air will smell like onions and diesel, and the hand that wrote in her log will ask you to be the 4th or the 5th at the table that was always supposed to have one more. Keep your mouth small. Speak inventory. Do not answer if the voice knows your name. Kill the engine like you mean it. And if the logbook writes hungry, write back not for me and leave the bowl where it is, the bowl. The first thing you learn flying little airplanes in big Alaska is that paper maps have better manners than the land does, and radios only tell the truth when they feel like it. I left the hub strip after noon in a Cessna on tundra tires with a box of antibiotics, 2 totes of flour, a bag of mail, and a promise I had made to myself about getting home before the light slid behind the low mountains and turned the river into polished slate. The forecast offered high clouds and a ceiling I could live under, a bit of northerly drift, and enough cold to make the prop bite hard. My plan was honest. A dogleg up the wide braid of the Koyukon, cut across a low saddle the caribou-like, and turned down toward a place my elders still called Nuvik, though the DOT charts had another name and a small gray X over it with a note that said, "Field closed, Village relocated. The relocation happened before I was born, when a spring flood tore the bank with a lazy cruelty and drew a new map no vote could veto. People built on higher ground and kept the old stories for winter. Nobody lands at Nuvik anymore unless they need gravel for a funeral. The air today had that polished feeling you get when the cold is respectful, the kind that makes the airplane hum in a single polite note and lets a man pretend skill is more than luck. I climbed to 2,000 to stay under the scud and trimmed for hands off so I could drink coffee without that old tremor that puts shame in your cup. The GPS drew a purple line like a blessing. The VHF hissed on 122.9, and the wind brushed the wings like a neighbor saying, "Keep your lane." I first heard it at 40 miles, a calm voice on Unicom with a cadence I recognized from elders, unhurried, sure of the weather, like a man who can taste wind. Nuvik traffic, Cessna 8. 2 Echo, winds favor 18, cleared to land, light cross from your left, gravel firm. I keyed the mic and said last I checked Nuvik was closed, and the purple line in my glass said so. The voice came back smiling without a smile and said, "Gravel is waiting and coffee is on. Report the river bend." I told myself some joker had renamed their village Unicom Nuvik to cheer themselves up and kept on, because bush pilots live longer when we put jokes in the right drawer. As the river widened to a winter mirror and the spruce thinned into willows, something in the light changed the way a room changes when a door opens behind you. The pattern of snow along the bank shifted from wind scribbles into lines that looked drawn. I saw tire tracks where no truck could ever come, a straight scrape down to gravel that led from nowhere to a windsock as bright as a fresh-cut tongue. The sock stood out clean with a lazy flick, and for a second I loved it for telling the truth. Beyond it sat houses in the old pattern the elders describe when they get wistful, not the tidy grid of relocation, but the river-hugging sprawl like a dog that has decided where to sleep. Smoke held level over low roofs and folded into fog as if the air had decided to wear a scarf. I circled because men who land on surprise runways earn new names and not the kind they bring home with pride. The strip lay straight and honest, cleared to gravel with 2 clean tire tracks down the center line and a line of oil barrels on the left, standing like they had finished an argument with the bulldozer last week. The chart on my knee insisted with all the confidence of ink that the strip had been removed. The view out the windshield disagreed with a patience that felt like insult. I made the calls anyway because procedures keep people breathing whether or not ghosts pass their check rides. Nuvik traffic 8. 2 Echo, overhead at 2,000, will join left downwind 18, full stop. The calm voice answered Roger with my tail number in a tone that made me think of teachers I used to disappoint. I wanted to key the mic and say, "Who are you?" but that is a question we save for bars, not for skies. On downwind, the village was a painting from a place that had not paid its electric bill since 1982. Sleds leaned on skids in the snow as if a hand had just let go. Fish racks carried dried silhouettes like prayer flags. Children's snow boots stood in neat pairs by doors. Nobody moved. The engine ran smooth and the oil temp sat right where any respectable A&P would want it. The only wrong thing was the way the air seemed to prefer that I fly the pattern perfectly. It pressed me into textbook when my own habits love a safe ugliness. I turned base over a bend where black water showed through, and it looked like a mouth that had learned patience. Final came with that clean, flat path you never get in wind unless the wind wants you. The tires kissed the gravel in a hush and the airplane settled like a dog sighing. I rolled out with small brake and the prop pulled me through the last little drift to a tie down where wooden posts drove through permafrost, stood ready for a rope I had in my pocket. The windsock hung in a thought. The Unicom said taxi to the clinic and I felt my nape stiffen because clinics do not talk, and I had not asked for directions yet. The gravel under my boots held a kind of heat that did not belong to sun. It felt like a stove that had decided to share. I tied the airplane because muscle memory does not consult fear, a simple bowline and a double half hitch because I do not trust knots that require elegance. The sound of my engine faded to the nervous ticking of metal wanting to change temperature. Beyond the wingtip, a skiff on a sled shone with fresh sand and paint. The name on the transom matched a family I knew had moved upriver. The door to the clinic opened a crack under its own authority, and a ribbon of warmer air exhaled into the street and got eaten by winter with satisfaction. Inside the clinic, I found lights that did not cast shadows correctly. The fluorescence made a green that preferred skin to walls. A radio sat on the counter tuned to the statewide mednet and whispered static that wanted to learn grammar. A chalkboard listed blood pressure clinic Thursday, immunizations Friday, potluck Saturday, and a name I knew had died in a year that runs along my tongue like a sliver. The clinic log lay open with today's date already written in a neat hand, along with a list of medicines that matched what I had in my cargo. The bottom line said flown in by 82 Echo and my name. I put my hand on the paper, and the pencil rolled off the spine without the room pretending it had been bumped. I signed because at some point a man chooses offense or courtesy, and I did not have breath for offense. The pencil did not scratch so much as agree. You can tell where life is by the smell. This place smelled like bleach and coffee and spruce floor cleaner and something else I will only call domestic. A pot on a back burner gave a thin sound for my blood to keep time with. Down the hall, the exam room sat with curtains half drawn and an otoscope lit like an altar. I stood in the doorway because thresholds deserve a nod, and saw a pair of boots under the bed at the far wall that had the empty look of lately used things. On the chair sat a parka that carried a border of frost feathers like lace. I said hello in the voice I use for people who might be in the next room and not ready to be people. In answer, the Unicom voice came through the open window from nowhere and told me the wind had backed a hair and I might like a little right rudder on takeoff. That made me smile in a way that did not reach my face, because this place had begun to offer the kind of help that leads a man deeper than he can climb out. I set the antibiotics on the counter because my hands wanted to do something honest. The radio clicked with a dead call sign I had not heard since I fixed my instructor's panel by bribing the voltage regulator with a tap. It said, Nuvik Clinic, medevac inbound from nowhere we can point to, 10 minutes, advise patient status. The chalkboard eraser jumped, fell off its shelf, and erased half the word potluck with a slow exactness that made me want to apologize to someone's aunt. I stepped back outside because sky is where I keep my thinking. The airstrip lay quiet in a white drape, and the houses watched me the way old photos watch. Across the lane, a school bell moved a fraction on its own hook. Beyond the bell, a woman's parka hung from a peg with the kind of drape that says, a body did or did not just leave. I am a pilot, not a poet, and I will tell you simply I felt watched, and the watcher had an opinion about my leaving. Back at the Cessna, I checked the oil and the fuel and the tie-downs, and found 2 new facts and 1 old comfort. The sump drain had the same little sheen it did when I left the hub, which meant nobody but me had been in there. The right tire had left a slightly deeper print than it should have after this short a time, which meant weight had shifted or the gravel had moved to agree with a story it preferred. The comfort was the airplane's smell, that mix of avgas and warm vinyl and the particular dust of maps, as faithful as a dog's breath. I climbed in and told myself we would go now and debate ghosts with a full tank at altitude like sensible men. The starter spun, and the prop took it like a handshake, and the engine caught and settled. The Unicom said, hold short for crossing traffic, and without meaning to, I pulled the throttle back to idle and looked up the far end of the strip where a dark shape moved like a super cub that had forgotten how to reflect light. It crossed the midfield at a slow float and did not disturb the air enough to twitch the windsock. My fingers began to count on their own the way they do when a man is borrowing superstition. Primer in, mixture rich, prop full, flaps 1 notch because gravel lies about length. I told the radio Nuvik traffic 82 Echo departing 18 southbound, and the voice said, hold position, and left me a silence with weight in it. I am not proud to report. I held. I craned my neck and looked for any craft that could command a field that did not exist and saw only the suggestion of a shadow turning into the bush. At some point in these jobs, the brain says inventory and the bones say rule, and those are the times you earn or spend your luck. My rule for places that do not exist is simple. Do not accept clearances from voices you cannot see. Do not follow helpful weather from a field the chart killed. Do not take off in obedience to a town that lives under paper. I set my heel on the brakes and ran the engine up to a point that would drown a small argument and listened for a cough. The cylinders sang plain. The needles sat where modest men sit in church. The unicom said, "You are home," and used my mother's rhythm to say it. I pulled mixture to lean a hair like you do when you intend to climb, and the engine responded with a small improvement that felt like an ally. I released the brakes and the airplane began its rolling argument with friction. I told the air out loud the weights I carried. Flour 208 pounds, antibiotics 13, mail 45, fuel enough for a man with doubts. When the tail came up, the unicom said, "Keep it on the ground for 3 more seconds, and you will wear our grooves properly," and I could suddenly see in my mind 100 takeoffs that did not end with a climb. I did the rude thing and disobeyed. I eased the yoke and let her float and then asked more, and the tires left a fine whisper of gravel, and the airplane stepped into her own element with a relief I felt under my scalp. The end of the strip came up fast because empty places sometimes prefer short runways. The houses on either side did not lean, but their windows reminded me that glass can be a mouth. I kept her level for a breath to get speed, and then pulled with the care of a man carrying a candle past a sleeping baby. The unicom said, "We need the medicine," and I told it inventory again and then numbers because numbers make order. Airspeed 65 rising, oil pressure green, CHT fine, flaps 1 to 0, and then the stick shook with a trespass I did not authorize. We climbed in dead calm that did not belong to a day with this many explanations missing. I banked left for a last look because pilots love looking down at what might have owned them and because my hands betray me with that habit. From 100 feet, the village already looked older. The tracks on the strip began to blur. Smoke rose and folded as if someone had lifted and dropped a blanket. At 200, the lanes between houses filled with the same flat light you get right after first snow. At 500, there was only a pale patch on the bend and a windsock lying down like a tired dog. By 1,000 feet, the gravel melted into the river's white, and the map on my knee suddenly agreed with the windshield, with the kind of smug that makes men swear. The X on the old strip sat clean and useless. The GPS purple line felt embarrassed about our detour and tried to draw a straight face. I leveled and set cruise and turned the nose toward the living village up on the bench that the state loves and the elders tolerate. My hands steadied in that cheap way adrenaline sells you after the bill comes. The radio went back to small hisses, and the mednet corrected itself into current call signs with the dull comfort of bureaucracy. I called the new village with my tail number, and the clinic answered with a voice I know that belongs to a nurse whose hands can stand where a hurricane walks. She said we were waiting, and do you have the amoxicillin? I said affirm, and she said any trouble with the wind. I said none and meant wind only. Over the bench, the plowed strip appeared with its cheerful machines and men in neon and the kind of order humans make when we intend to stay. I landed fine because landing fine is cheaper than stories. On rollout, I realized my right tire had picked up a thin line of red silt the color of an old river at breakup. The newer strip has gravel from a quarry that never met that color. An elder helped me unload and asked where I picked up that pretty paint. I said the river likes me, and he did not challenge me because both of us have learned that making a story smaller can be another name for respect. Inside the living clinic, I set the antibiotics on a counter that threw honest shadows and signed a log that did not move under my hand. The nurse poured me coffee that had not learned any tricks and asked after my mother with the nosiness of family. An old man with eyes that cataloged the weather stood by the door and said in a voice that carried no drama that the old village gets hungry at the turn of the year and sometimes sets a table. He said, "Do not sit." He said, "Do not land if the sock is the wrong color." He said, "Talk inventory if the radio knows your name." He said, "If you must land, keep the engine warm and do not touch the clinic bell cord and leave your last cup of coffee on the step as payment for any kindnesses you cannot put into a report." I said I had left nothing but footprints in a knot. He nodded in approval, like I had paid a small debt. Back at my airplane, I checked the fuel as a ritual and found the levels exactly where math said they should be if I had diverted not at all. I wiped the oil with a rag that had learned to mind and found a thumbprint near the cowl that did not belong to my gloves. In my cargo, I found the mail sack still tied, and on top of it a folded paper that had not been there before. It was a sheet torn from a clinic log that smelled like my childhood schoolroom. On it, a neat hand had written the same rule the elder had said: do not sit. Under that, someone had scratched with a harder hand 3 words that learned my letters: do not answer. I tucked it in my chart case because some reminders need to ride where our eyes live. After dark in my bunk at the hub, I lay with the sound of a plane heater ticking and heard the wind fuss at the hangar door, like a pet wanting to be invited. I thought of the voice on Unicom, using my mother's rhythm, and the way the wheels left gravel, and the way the houses did not lean, and the way the world agreed with itself only when I climbed. I slept, because men do after a day that could have taken them. In the morning, I looked up Nuvik in the state database and found the same paragraph I have always found: relocated in 82 after flood, emergency landings not advised due to erosion, field equipment removed, coordinate listed for historical purposes only. Someone had added a note at the bottom dated 2 years ago: do not respond to transmissions on the listed frequency from unidentified sources. Report to FAA if received. I called the number because sometimes duty looks like superstition wearing a tie. The man on the line said thank you in a tone that expected nothing more, and I folded that into a pocket with other adult gestures. I still fly that country. On clear days when the river lies like glass in January light, I can see the old bend if I want to, and I do not want to. When scud drops and the horizon smudges into the hood of the airplane, I talk inventory and I name my airspeeds and I keep my pattern loose around places ink tries to forget. Now and then, on 122.9, a calm voice with the manners of an elder will tell me winds favor 1/8, and coffee is on, and I will thank it inside my tongue for keeping its distance. If you ever take a small airplane over a big country, and the chart says a village is gone, and the world below says the soup is hot, and a tie-down waits with your name on it, you will have choices. Set the rule before the voice sets it for you. Do not accept clearances from empty places. Do not land at a runway that arrives after the map. If you must, leave the engine warm. Leave a cup on the step, and when the air tells you to hold for traffic you cannot point to, roll and go, because survival is a kind of impoliteness. I did not bring anyone back from the river that day, but I brought a new rule home, and that has kept me breathing more than once. The next time the Unicom used my tail number, I told it the color of my jacket and the number of bolts on the panel, and the direction of the wind over my left cheek, and it went quiet in the way a door goes quiet when it realizes you are already inside your own house.